Hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. Before we start today's video, I'd really appreciate your support. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. The channel is going through a difficult time at the moment, and your likes, comments, and support truly mean the world to me. Thank you so much for being here. Now let's get into today's story. The radio crackled to life at 5:47 a.m., jolting me from the thin sleep I'd managed in my ranger station bunk. Static filled the small cabin before Bennett's voice cut through, tense and unfamiliar. "Base, this is Patrol 7. We've got something out here at Walker Lake. You need to send someone up." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and reached for the handset. 3 years working the Kaibab National Forest, and I'd never heard Bennett sound like that. The man was steady as granite, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything from bear maulings to lost hikers turned desperate. "This is Base. What's your situation, Bennett?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd lost contact. Then, "It's the livestock. All of Vincent's cattle. Christ, I don't know how to describe this." I was already pulling on my boots. Vincent Yazzie ran a small ranch on the border of the Apache reservation, grazing his cattle on federal land under permit. Good man, kept to himself mostly, but never caused trouble. On my way. 20 minutes. The drive through the pre-dawn darkness gave me time to think, though I tried not to. Growing up in Sedona, I'd heard the stories. Whispers passed between families with roots in the Four Corners country. Tales that made even skeptical park rangers check their locks twice. My grandmother had been half Navajo, and while she'd never spoken directly about such things, I remembered the way she'd go quiet when certain topics arose. The way she'd insist we burn sage after particularly dark dreams. I found Bennett's patrol vehicle parked at the access road to Vincent's grazing land. He was standing next to it, smoking with shaking hands, the first time I'd ever seen him with a cigarette. "Took you long enough," he said, "but there was no heat in it, just exhaustion." "Show me." We walked up the dirt track together, flashlights cutting through the morning gloom. The air felt wrong somehow. Too still, too quiet. Even the insects had gone silent. "Vincent called the sheriff's department around 4, Bennett explained as we walked. "Dispatch figured it was our jurisdiction since it happened on federal land. Sheriff Damien asked us to take the initial report." "Animal attack?" Bennett stopped walking. "That's what I thought. That's what I hoped." The smell hit us first, metallic and rotten, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something that made my nose burn and my stomach turn. Then we crested the small rise, and I saw what had shaken Bennett so badly. 17 head of cattle lay scattered across the meadow in what might have been a pattern, though my mind refused to process the geometry of it. They hadn't simply been killed. They'd been arranged. Each animal had been opened with surgical precision, organs removed and placed in neat piles beside the carcasses. The ground around them was dark with blood, but there were no tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication that these animals had fought for their lives. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "Gets worse," Bennett said. He led me to the nearest carcass, a young bull that had been Vincent's pride. "Look at the cuts." I knelt beside the animal, forcing myself to examine the wounds. The incisions were impossibly clean, made with something sharper than any knife I'd ever seen. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the fact that every cut began and ended in exactly the same place on each animal, following an identical pattern that seemed to have been burned into my memory from childhood nightmares I couldn't quite recall. "Have you called this in yet?" I asked. "Waiting for you. Figured you'd want to see it first, before the feds come stomping through here." I stood and dusted off my knees, trying to think clearly. Protocol demanded I contact the FBI's livestock crime unit, but something deeper, some instinct I'd inherited from my grandmother's side of the family, told me that involving outsiders would only make things worse. "Let's talk to Vincent first. Get his story." We found Vincent Yazzie sitting on his porch, staring out at nothing. He was a big man, mid-50s, with calloused hands and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. But now he looked small, diminished, like something had been drained out of him. "Vincent," I called out as we approached. "I'm sorry about your cattle." He looked up at us with eyes that seemed much older than they had the last time I'd seen him. "You boys shouldn't be out here. We need to ask you some questions," Bennett said, "for the report." Vincent shook his head slowly. "Won't do any good. This isn't something you can put in a report." I sat down on the porch steps, trying to seem non-threatening. "Why don't you tell us what you saw?" "Wasn't what I saw," Vincent said quietly. "Was what I heard. Around midnight, the cattle started making noise. Not scared noise, wrong noise, like they were calling to something." He paused, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. "I went out to check on them, had my rifle, flashlight, dog, normal things. But when I got to the fence line, everything went quiet. Dead quiet. Even Silas. He gestured to a German shepherd lying motionless on the porch. For a horrible moment I thought the dog was dead, until I saw its sides moving in rapid, shallow breaths. What happened to your dog? Found him like that this morning. Won't wake up, but he's breathing. Vet won't come out here. Vincent took a long drag of his cigarette. Had to call you boys because insurance requires a police report, but we both know what this is. Bennett shifted uncomfortably. Vincent, if you have information about who might have done this— Not who, Vincent interrupted. What? And you know it too, don't you? He was looking directly at me now. You got the look. Your grandmother was Marie Begay, wasn't she? From over by Monument Valley. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How did you know my grandmother? She came out here once, maybe 15 years ago. Talked to my father about things. Old things. Said her granddaughter might need to know about them someday. Vincent stood up, stubbed out his cigarette. You should go talk to Harrison Begay. He's her nephew, still lives on the reservation. He'll tell you what you need to know. Vincent, I said carefully. Are you saying you think this was done by— But he was already walking back into his house. Don't say the word, he called over his shoulder. Not out here, not in daylight, and don't come back after sunset. The door closed behind him with a finality that made my skin crawl. Bennett and I drove back to the ranger station in silence. What do you say when you've just seen something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world? How do you write a report that captures the wrongness of those cattle, the surgical precision of their mutilation, the complete absence of any rational explanation? Back at the station, I poured coffee and stared at the blank incident report. Bennett had gone home to his family, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that this was just the beginning. I thought about my grandmother, about the stories she'd never quite told me, about the way she'd always insisted I wear the small turquoise pendant she'd given me when I turned 18. I was wearing it now, had never taken it off, though I'd never been sure why. The phone rang, making me jump. Kaibab Ranger Station. This is Sheriff Damien. I hear you boys had an interesting morning. That's one way to put it. I'm sending Deputy Chase out to take statements. This is going to be a joint investigation. Us, you folks, maybe the FBI if things get weird. I almost laughed. If things got weird. Sheriff, I think we might want to handle this locally for now. Keep it quiet while we investigate. Why's that? I looked out the window at the forest, at the shadows between the trees that seemed deeper than they should be in full daylight. Because I don't think this was done by anyone the FBI is equipped to handle. After I hung up, I sat alone in the station as afternoon faded to evening, writing and rewriting the same report, trying to find words that captured what we'd seen without sounding insane. Outside, the forest grew dark, and for the first time since I'd taken this job, I found myself checking the locks on the doors. Somewhere in the distance I could swear I heard cattle calling, but there were no cattle within 20 miles of the ranger station. The sound came again, closer now, and I realized it wasn't cattle at all. It was something pretending to be cattle. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the forest, and there were many, sent my hand reaching for the service pistol I kept in the nightstand drawer. When dawn finally broke, I was already dressed and making coffee, grateful to have survived until morning. The official reports would wait. I needed answers, and Vincent had pointed me toward the only person who might have them. The drive to the Navajo Nation took 2 hours through country that grew increasingly desolate with each mile. Red rock mesas rose like monuments to ancient gods, while scrub brush and juniper trees dotted the landscape between them. This was old land, the kind that held memories in its bones. I'd called ahead to the tribal headquarters in Window Rock, explained that I needed to speak with Harrison Begay about a livestock incident. The woman who answered, Neva, according to her nameplate when I arrived, looked at me with curious eyes. Harrison doesn't usually talk to outsiders about incidents, she said carefully, but he said he'd see you. Something about your grandmother. She gave me directions to Harrison's home, a modest house set back from the main road with a view of Shiprock in the distance. The monolith dominated the horizon, its volcanic spire reaching toward clouds that seemed permanently gathered around its peak. Harrison Begay was waiting on his porch when I arrived. He was older than I'd expected, maybe 70, with silver hair pulled back in a traditional style and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. But his eyes were sharp, alert, and when he looked at me, I felt like he was seeing straight through to my bones. You're Marie's grandson, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. She passed 5 years ago. I know. She came to me in dreams, told me you'd be coming. He gestured to a chair beside him. Sit. We have much to discuss. I settled into the wooden chair, trying to organize my thoughts. Mr. Begay, I'm investigating some cattle killings near Walker Lake. Vincent Yazzie suggested I speak with you. Vincent is a good man. He knows when to ask for help. Harrison lit a pipe, the sweet scent of tobacco mixing with sage smoke that seemed to drift from somewhere nearby. Tell me what you saw. I described the scene at Vincent's ranch, the surgical precision of the wounds, the arrangement of the bodies, the absence of tracks or signs of struggle. Harrison listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grave. And what did you feel? He asked when I finished. Feel? Your grandmother gave you something. Protection. What did it tell you? Almost unconsciously, my hand moved to the turquoise pendant at my throat. The moment I touched it, I felt a warmth that I realized had been missing since yesterday morning. It felt wrong, like the whole place was wrong. Harrison nodded. Your grandmother was wise. She knew this day would come. Mr. Big A, I need to understand what we're dealing with. Vincent seemed to think. I paused, struggling with words that felt dangerous to speak aloud. You can't say it, Harrison observed. Good, that shows respect. But you need to understand, or more people will die. He stood and walked to the edge of his porch, looking out at the vast landscape. There are things in this world that your people have forgotten. Things that never forgot your people. Is that what killed Vincent's cattle? That was just the beginning. Let's call it a test, to see how much attention it would draw, how much your people would believe. Harrison turned back to me. Your grandmother asked me to teach you, if this day came. Are you ready to learn? I thought about the wrongness I'd felt at the ranch, about the sounds I'd heard outside my window last night. Yes. Harrison disappeared into his house and returned with a leather satchel. From it he withdrew several items, a small bag of what looked like ground herbs, a piece of carved bone, and a photograph that made my blood freeze. It was my grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. They were both holding rifles and looking down at something on the ground, something that might have been human except for the way its limbs bent, the way its face seemed to shift even in the still photograph. This was taken in 1952, Harrison said, near what you now call Skinwalker Ranch. Your grandmother was part of a group that dealt with problems. When the traditional ways weren't enough anymore. Skinwalker Ranch? The name sent a chill through me. I've heard of it. Some kind of paranormal research facility. Now it is. Back then, it was just a place where the barriers were thin, where things could cross over that shouldn't. Harrison put the photograph away. But that's not the only place. There are thin spots all through this country. 9 Mile Valley, Blind Frog Ranch, parts of Utah Territory where the old maps warned travelers not to go. He handed me the bag of herbs. Mix this with tobacco. Burn it if you sense danger. It won't stop one of them, but it will mask your scent, make you harder to track. One of them? Harrison's eyes went hard. Ye Naldlushi, skinwalkers, witches who traded their humanity for power. They can take any form, but they prefer predators. Wolves, bears, coyotes, sometimes birds of prey. They hunt in packs, and they're drawn to fear and violence. But the cattle were just food, or a message, or both. Harrison handed me the carved bone. This is older than the reservation, older than your government, older than the Spanish. It will burn if one of them is near. Keep it with you always. I took the bone, surprised by its warmth. Mr. Bigay, why are they active now? Vincent said this was the first time anything like this had happened in his area, because someone called them. Harrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Someone with knowledge, someone who knew the old ways. The question is why. We spent the rest of the morning discussing what Harrison called practical matters. How to recognize sign, how to protect myself and others, how to know when I was dealing with something beyond my capabilities. As the sun reached its zenith, he walked me back to my truck. One more thing, he said as I climbed behind the wheel. They can mimic voices. Perfectly. If someone calls to you from the darkness, don't answer. Don't go looking. And if your radio starts picking up voices you don't recognize, turn it off immediately. The drive back to the ranger station felt longer than it had coming out. Every shadow seemed deeper, every bird call more ominous. The carved bone in my pocket grew warm twice during the journey, and both times I found myself scanning the landscape for movement that shouldn't be there. I was still 20 miles from the station when my radio crackled to life. Base, this is Elena. We have a situation at the campground. Elena Rodriguez was our newest ranger, fresh out of training and eager to prove herself. She'd been assigned to patrol the developed areas while I handled the backcountry. What's the situation, Elena? Missing camper. Family of 4 checked in yesterday. The Austins. Tyler Austin called this morning to report his father went for a walk last night and never came back. I felt the bone in my pocket grow noticeably warmer. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Have you searched the immediate area? That's the thing. We found tracks leading away from their campsite, but they'd just stop. Like he vanished into thin air, or like something had carried him away. Elena, I want you to stay with the family. Don't let anyone else go looking. That's an order. Copy that. But there's something else. The tracks we found, they're not quite right. Like the feet were too big, or the stride was wrong, or the radio went silent. I called Elena's name twice before a different voice came through the speaker. Male, unfamiliar, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but that made every instinct I'd inherited from my grandmother scream in alarm. I turned off the radio and pressed harder on the accelerator. The campground was in chaos when I arrived. Elena had followed orders and kept the Austin family together, but other campers had heard about the missing man and were demanding answers. I could see the fear in their faces, the way they kept glancing at the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. What's the situation? I asked Elena quietly. Justin Austin, age 42, went for a walk around 10 p.m. last night. His wife Caroline says he was upset about something, kept staring off into the woods during dinner. She thought he just needed air. And the tracks? Elena led me away from the main group to a spot behind the Austin family's tent. The ground here was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding impressions. At first glance, they looked like normal boot prints, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive tread pattern. But the more I looked, the more wrong they seemed. The stride was too long for a normal human gait. The impressions were deeper than they should be, as if whatever made them weighed significantly more than a middle-aged accountant from Phoenix. And there was something else, something that made my grandmother's pendant grow cold against my chest. Elena, I want everyone out of here. Now. What? Clear the campground. Tell them we have a gas leak. Bear activity, anything. Just get them packed and gone within the hour. Sir, with respect, isn't that an overreaction? One missing hiker, the scream that split the afternoon air cut her off mid-sentence. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, human enough to be recognizable but wrong in every other way. Too long, too high, too full of agony to have come from any throat that still belonged to something entirely human. Elena's face went white. Was that? Move. Everyone out. Now. As Elena organized the evacuation, I followed the tracks deeper into the forest. They led away from the campground in a straight line, as if whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. The carved bone in my pocket grew warmer with each step, and the familiar sense of pine and earth began to mix with something else, something that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. The tracks ended at a clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd been patrolling this area for 3 years. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. The ground inside the circle was dark, stained with something that definitely wasn't mud, but there was no sign of Justin Austin. Instead, there was something else. Something that made me back away slowly, my hand moving to the service pistol at my hip. Hanging from the lowest branch of an ancient oak tree was what looked like a cocoon, roughly human-sized, wrapped in what might have been spider silk if any spider grew large enough to produce that much. The cocoon was moving. I was reaching for my radio when I heard Elena's voice calling my name from somewhere behind me. But Elena was supposed to be back at the campground, evacuating campers, and the voice was coming from 3 different directions at once. I didn't answer the voices calling my name. Harrison's warning echoed in my memory as I backed away from the clearing, keeping my eyes on the writhing cocoon while straining to listen for actual movement in the underbrush. The voices continued. Elena's voice, Bennett's voice, even what sounded like my own grandmother calling to me in Navajo words I remembered from childhood. The carved bone was hot enough now to burn through the fabric of my pocket. Whatever was out there, it was close. I made it back to the campground to find Elena supervising the last of the evacuating campers. The Austin family was loading their SUV, Caroline Austin's face streaked with tears while their 2 children, Maya and Kingston, maybe 8 and 10 years old, looked around with the bewildered fear that children show when adults can't explain what's happening. Did you find anything? Elena asked as I approached. I studied her face carefully, looking for some sign that this wasn't really Eleni. The eyes were right. The voice was right, but Harrison had warned me about their ability to mimic. How long have I been gone? Maybe 20 minutes? You said to evacuate everyone, so that's what I did. She paused, reading something in my expression. Sir, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Elena, I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell me about the first day we met, the exact conversation we had. Her brow furrowed. That's kind of a weird request. It was 3 months ago, at the district briefing in Flagstaff. You asked me why I wanted to be a park ranger, and I told you about my grandfather who worked for the Forest Service. You said I had good instincts but needed to learn when to trust them. It was exactly what I remembered. Either this was really Elena, or whatever was out there had access to memories that should have been impossible to obtain. There's something I need to tell you, I said. But not here. Follow me back to the main station. During the drive, I tried to organize my thoughts. How do you explain to a rational person that they're dealing with something that exists outside the bounds of rational reality? How do you prepare someone for the possibility that everything they see and hear might be a lie designed to draw them into the darkness? At the station, I made coffee and told Elena to sit down. Then, as carefully as I could, I explained what Harrison had taught me. I showed her the carved bone, the herbs, the pendant my grandmother had given me. I described what I'd found in the forest, the stone circle, the cocoon, the voices that had tried to lure me deeper into the woods. Elena listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to concern to something approaching belief. "So you're telling me," she said when I finished, "that we're dealing with some kind of, what, Native American werewolves? Not werewolves. Something worse. Something that chose to become what it is." Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the forest as darkness began to gather between the trees. "Assuming I believe this, which I'm not sure I do, what's our next move? We can't evacuate the entire forest." Before I could answer, the radio crackled to life. This time it was Sheriff Damien's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. "All units, we have a code red situation. Multiple missing persons reported in the Sedona area. Last known locations all within 10 miles of federal forest land." I grabbed the handset. "Sheriff, this is the Kaibab station. How many missing?" 12 so far. Hikers, campers, couple of locals who went out hunting. All disappeared in the last 48 hours. Static filled the line for a moment. "There's something else. We found remains at several of the last known locations." "What kind of remains?" "The kind that make experienced deputies call in sick." I exchanged a look with Elena. "Sheriff, I think we need to coordinate our response. This might be connected to the livestock killings." "Agreed. I'm setting up a command post at the Sedona substation. Can you meet me there in 2 hours?" On our way, Elena and I gathered emergency supplies, extra ammunition, first aid kits, flashlights, batteries. I also packed the herbs Harrison had given me and made sure my grandmother's pendant was secure around my neck. "One question," Elena said as we loaded the truck. "If these things are as dangerous as you say, why are we heading toward them instead of calling for federal backup? Because federal agents don't carry carved bone and sage? Because they'll go in with helicopters and night vision and tactical teams, and all they'll accomplish is getting more people killed?" I started the engine. "And because I'm starting to think this isn't random, someone called them here. Someone with a purpose." The drive to Sedona took us through country that grew increasingly ominous as full darkness settled over the landscape. We passed several roadblocks, state police turning back civilian traffic, keeping people away from areas that had become hunting grounds. The Sedona substation was a hive of activity when we arrived. Sheriff Damien had indeed set up a command post, with maps spread across tables and deputies manning radios. But I could see the strain in their faces, the way their eyes kept darting to the windows. "Glad you could make it," Sheriff Damien said when he saw us. He was a big man, mid-50s, with a kind of mustache that belonged in an old Western movie. But now he looked haggard, like he'd aged 5 years in the last 2 days. "What's the situation?" He led us to the main map table. Red pins marked last known locations of the missing persons, while black pins marked where remains had been found. The pattern was disturbing. A rough circle with Sedona at its center, gradually contracting as if something was drawing a noose tighter around the town. "Started day before yesterday," Sheriff Damien explained. "Couple of hikers didn't return from Cathedral Rock. We found their camp this morning. Tents torn open from the inside, like something had burst out of them. But no bodies." "And the remains you mentioned?" Deputy Chase, a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, spoke up. "We found pieces at Bell Rock, Airport Mesa, Chapel of the Holy Cross, always arranged in patterns, always surgical cuts." He swallowed hard. "And always at places that are supposed to be spiritual vortexes." Elena frowned. "Vortexes? Sedona thing," I explained. "Certain locations where people claim to feel spiritual energy. New Age tourists come from all over the world to meditate at them." "Which might explain the pattern," Sheriff Damien said grimly. "If something was feeding on, let's call it psychic energy, those would be the places to hunt." A chill ran down my spine. "Sheriff, have you had any contact with the missing persons? Radio calls, cell phone calls, anything?" "That's the strangest part. Several families have reported getting calls from their missing relatives. But the calls don't make sense. Voices that sound right but say wrong things. Asking family members to come out and join them in the wilderness." The carved bone in my pocket was warm, but not burning. Whatever was out there wasn't close. Not yet. But it was definitely present. "I think we need to assume this is going to get worse before it gets better," I said. "How many people do we have?" 12 deputies, plus you Forest Service folks. State police have another 8 units in the area. but they're staying on the highways. Sheriff Damien rubbed his eyes. Problem is, we don't know what we're hunting. Every report is different. Some people see wolves, others see bears. A few swear they saw people walking on all fours. One guy claims he saw his dead brother beckoning him from across a canyon. They're all probably right, I said quietly. Before anyone could ask what I meant, the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a few seconds later, bathing the station in red light that made everyone's face look like something from a horror movie. Outside, we could hear generators starting up across the town, the background hum of civilization reasserting itself. But in the brief moment of darkness, I'd heard something else. Voices calling from the desert. Human voices speaking in perfect English, calling out the names of everyone in the room. Deputy Zachary was moving toward the door. Did you hear that? Someone's calling for help out there. Don't, I said sharply. Nobody goes outside. Nobody responds to voices in the dark. But if someone needs help, it's not someone, Elena said, and I was glad to hear the certainty in her voice. It's something that wants us to think it's someone. Sheriff Damien looked between us with growing understanding. You boys know something about what's out there. I nodded. And if we're going to survive the night, you're going to have to trust us. That's when Deputy George burst through the back door, his face white with terror and his uniform torn. They got Nicholas, he gasped. They got him right off the patrol car. But the thing is, he looked around at all of us with wild eyes. Nicholas is still out there. I can hear him talking on the radio. But I watched something drag him into the desert 5 minutes ago. As if summoned by his words, Nicholas's voice came through the radio speakers, calm and professional. All units, this is Deputy Barrett. I'm pursuing suspects on foot toward Cathedral Rock, requesting backup. We all stared at the radio. Nicholas Barrett had been dead for 3 years, killed in a car accident on Highway 17. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of footsteps circling the building. Too many footsteps, moving in perfect synchronization like a pack of predators testing the strength of their prey's defenses. The hunt had found us. The footsteps circled the building 3 times before stopping. In the silence that followed, we could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from multiple directions. Sheriff Damien motioned for everyone to stay quiet while he moved to the window and peered through a gap in the blinds. How many do you see? I whispered. That's the problem. I don't see anything, but I can hear at least 6 of them out there. The radio crackled again, and this time it was Deputy Chase's voice, except Chase was standing right next to me, staring at the radio with growing horror. Sheriff, this is Chase. I'm at Airport Mesa with the missing hikers. They're all fine, just lost. Can you send some units to pick them up? The real Chase started toward the radio, but I grabbed his arm. Don't answer. But if the hikers are, they're not fine. They're dead. And that's not really you on the radio. Sheriff Damien backed away from the window. Motion sensors around the perimeter just lit up. We've got movement on all sides. I pulled the bag of herbs from my pack and began sprinkling them around the room's entry points. The scent of sage and something else, something older and more powerful, filled the air. Several of the deputies wrinkled their noses, but I noticed the oppressive feeling that had been building since nightfall seemed to ease slightly. What's that supposed to do? Elena asked. Mask our scent. Make it harder for them to track us. I finished with the herbs and moved to check the building's security. But it won't stop them if they really want to get in. Deputy George was still shaking from his encounter in the desert. I need to tell you what I saw out there when they took Nicholas. Nicholas has been dead for 3 years, Sheriff Damien said gently. Not Nicholas Barrett. Nicholas Cole, new guy, started last week. They got him, but George ran his hands through his hair. The thing that took him, it looked like me, exactly like me. It was wearing my face. Elena made a small sound of distress. That's not possible. A lot of impossible things are happening tonight, I said. George, where did this happen? Mile marker 7 on Thunder Mountain Road. I was responding to a call about stranded motorists. When I got there, I found my own patrol car already at the scene. I watched myself get out and talk to Nicholas. And then I watched myself, he shuddered. It wasn't me, but it was perfect. Even the way I walk, the way I hold my shoulders, the implications hit me like a physical blow. If they could perfectly mimic appearance as well as voice, if they could replicate our vehicles and equipment, then we couldn't trust anything we saw outside these walls. Sheriff, I said, I need to make a call. I dialed Harrison Begay's number, hoping the old man would answer. The phone rang 5 times before his familiar voice came through. I was expecting your call, he said without preamble. Mr. Begay, they're hunting in packs. They can mimic appearance perfectly. We're trapped in the Sedona substation with hostile contacts surrounding the building. How many of you? 14. Mixed law enforcement. Too many. They'll pick you off one by one if you stay together. Harrison's voice was calm, matter of fact. You need to split up. Make them divide their attention. That sounds like suicide. Staying together is suicide. They're patient. They'll wait until you're exhausted, until someone makes a mistake. Then they'll kill you all. I heard papers rustling on his end of the line. There's a place you need to reach. Red Rock State Park, the visitor center. It's built on ground that was sacred long before the park existed. They can't cross the threshold. How do we get there without them picking us off? Some of you won't make it, but some might. It's the only chance you have. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a moment before turning back to the others. Sheriff Damien was studying the map, calculating distances and routes. The deputies were checking their weapons, their faces grim but determined. What did he say? Elena asked. We need to reach Red Rock State Park. It's our only chance. That's 15 miles, Sheriff Damien protested. Through open desert, at night, with those things out there hunting us. If we stay here, we die, I said simply. If we try to reach the park, some of us might live. Deputy Zachary spoke up from his position by the radio. I'm getting calls from all over the county. Missing persons reports, strange sightings, people reporting family members who've been acting wrong. They're expanding their operation, Elena said. This isn't just about Sedona anymore. Sheriff Damien made his decision. We split into 3 groups, take separate routes to the park. Group with the best luck calls for backup once they reach safety. Sheriff, I said carefully, we need to consider the possibility that some of us aren't who we appear to be. The room went silent. Everyone looked at everyone else with new suspicion, with the terrible understanding that any one of us could be a perfect predator wearing a familiar face. How do we verify? Deputy Chase asked. I thought about what Harrison had told me, about the old ways and the protections that had kept his people safe for generations. Personal information that would be difficult for an outsider to know. Childhood memories, family details, things that aren't in any file. We spent the next 20 minutes questioning each other. Painful, intimate details that proved our humanity. It was Elena who asked me about the scar on my left hand, and when I correctly explained that I'd gotten it at age 7 trying to rescue a kitten from a barbed wire fence, I saw the relief in her eyes. But as we prepared to leave the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. That one of the shapes moving through the darkness outside wasn't what it appeared to be. We divided into 3 groups. Sheriff Damien with deputies Chase and George heading north through the main canyon. Deputy Zachary with 2 state troopers, Maxwell and Diego, taking the southern route. Elena and I, along with Deputy Cole, would follow the eastern path through the desert. If anyone doesn't make it, Sheriff Damien said, tell our families we died fighting. We're not dead yet, Elena said firmly. We slipped out of the station through the rear exit, moving in single file toward our designated route. The desert night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to navigate by. But the silence was absolute. No insects, no small animals, no wind through the cacti. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. We'd made it maybe half a mile when Cole stopped suddenly. Do you hear that? He whispered. I listened. In the distance, carried on the still air, I could hear voices, familiar voices, calling our names with increasing urgency. Help! Over here! We're trapped! It was Sheriff Damien's voice, and Chase's voice, and George's voice. They got the others, Cole said, starting to move toward the sounds. Elena grabbed his arm. No, that's not them. But listen, I said. How many voices do you hear? Cole concentrated. 3, the sheriff and his group, all calling for help at the same time. All from the same location. Even if they were in trouble, they wouldn't all be shouting simultaneously. They'd designate one person to call for backup while the others provided security. Cole's face went pale as understanding dawned. They're trying to draw us in, which means the real Sheriff Damien and his team are either dead or... I didn't finish the thought. We continued east, moving as quietly as possible through the scattered juniper and prickly pear. Red Rock State Park was still 12 miles away, and dawn was at least 6 hours off. The carved bone in my pocket had been warm since we left the station, but now it was getting hot enough to be painful. That's when we saw the lights, flashlight beams, moving through the desert parallel to our position. At first I thought it might be the real sheriff's group, but as the lights drew closer, I could see there were too many of them. At least 8 beams, moving in perfect formation like a military patrol. Down, I whispered, and we dropped behind a cluster of barrel cacti. The lights passed within 50 yards of our position. In their glow, I could make out human figures, men in law enforcement uniforms, carrying standard-issue equipment. They looked exactly right, moved exactly right, even spoke in the quiet, professional tones of trained officers conducting a search. But something was wrong with their shadows. In the shifting beams of their flashlights, Their shadows didn't match their movements. They bent at impossible angles, stretched too far, moved independently of the figures that cast them. Elena squeezed my arm and pointed. One of the figures had stopped and was looking directly at our hiding place. In the moonlight, its face was perfectly human, except for the eyes, which reflected light like an animal's. It opened its mouth and spoke in Sheriff Damien's voice. "I know you're out there. We just want to help." None of us moved. None of us breathed. After what felt like hours, the figure turned and rejoined the patrol. They continued south, their lights fading into the distance. "Jesus Christ," Cole whispered. "What are they?" "Hunters," I said, "and we're the prey." We pressed on through the desert, staying low and moving carefully. The terrain was rough. Loose rock, hidden arroyos, cacti that seemed to reach out and tear at our clothing. But we were making progress. By my estimate, we were about halfway to the park when Elena called for a halt. "Something's wrong," she said. "What do you mean?" She pointed back the way we'd come. "Look at our tracks." I knelt and examined the ground behind us. Our footprints were clearly visible in the sandy soil, but there were other impressions beside them. Larger prints, with an odd gait that seemed almost but not quite human. "How long have those been there?" Cole asked. "I don't know, but there are at least 3 sets." I stood and scanned the horizon. "We're being followed." That's when we heard the howling. It started as a single voice, somewhere behind us in the darkness. Then another joined it, and another, until the desert rang with a chorus that was almost but not quite the sound of wolves. It was too organized, too purposeful, too full of intelligence to be entirely animal. "They're calling to each other," Elena said. "Coordinating." "Run," I said. We abandoned stealth and sprinted across the desert, stumbling over rocks and crashing through brush. Behind us, the howling grew closer, and I could hear the sound of pursuit. Footsteps that came too fast, covered too much ground with each stride. Cole went down first, his foot catching in a hidden hole. I heard his ankle snap from 20 feet away, saw him roll and come up with his weapon drawn. "Keep going," he shouted. "I'll hold them off." Cole, no. His first shot lit up the night, and in the muzzle flash I saw something that made me grab Elena's hand and drag her forward at a dead run. The thing approaching Cole was human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too tall, joints that bent the wrong way, fingers that were too long and ended in claws. Cole's second shot was followed by a scream that cut off abruptly. Elena and I ran through the darkness, our lungs burning and our legs cramping, while behind us the sounds of feeding filled the night. We didn't stop until we saw lights ahead, the blessed sight of the Red Rock State Park Visitor Center, its windows glowing with warm electric light. We collapsed against the building's front door, gasping for breath. The carved bone in my pocket had gone cold for the first time in hours. "Are we safe?" Elena asked. Before I could answer, we heard a familiar voice calling from the darkness behind us. "Elena, thank God you made it." It was Cole's voice, warm with relief and completely uninjured. Elena started toward the sound, but I held her back. "Cole's dead," I whispered. We both heard him die. The voice called again, closer now. "Elena, it's me. I got away. I'm hurt. I need help." In the glow from the visitor center windows, I could see a figure limping toward us across the desert. It looked exactly like Cole. Same height, same uniform, same face. Even the way it favored its left leg matched the injury we'd seen him sustain. But its shadow was wrong, stretching too far and bending at angles that defied the light source. Elena raised her weapon. "That's not Cole." The figure stopped, maybe 30 yards away. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of hurt confusion that was perfectly human. "Elena, it's me. I don't understand why you're pointing that gun at me." "Because you're not you," she said steadily. "You're something wearing his face." The thing that looked like Cole stood motionless for a long moment. Then, slowly, it began to smile. A smile that was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Clever girl," it said in Cole's voice. "But you can't stay in there forever." Dawn was still hours away. The thing wearing Cole's face circled the visitor center for the rest of the night. Sometimes it walked upright, maintaining the perfect illusion of our fallen colleague. Other times, when it thought we couldn't see clearly through the windows, it moved differently. On all fours, with a fluid grace that no human could achieve, Elena and I had barricaded ourselves inside the center's main exhibit hall, using everything we could find to block the doors and windows. The building felt safe in a way I couldn't quite explain. The air itself seemed different, cleaner, charged with some kind of protective energy that made my grandmother's pendant warm against my chest. "Talk to me," Elena said around 3 a.m. "Tell me something real. Something human." I understood what she meant. After hours of listening to Cole's voice pleading from the darkness, after watching shadows move in ways that defied physics, we both needed to anchor ourselves to reality. "My grandmother used to make fry bread every Sunday," I said. "She'd start before dawn, and the smell would fill the whole house. She said the recipe came from her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother, all the way back to before the Long Walk. The Long Walk? When the government forced the Navajo people from their homeland to internment camps in New Mexico. 1864. My family lost everything. Their land, their sheep, their traditional way of life. But they kept the recipes, the stories, the knowledge of how to protect themselves from things that hunt in the darkness. Elena was quiet for a moment. Is that what we're dealing with? Some kind of ancient evil? I think we're dealing with people who chose to become something else, who traded their humanity for power and became. I gestured toward the window, where Cole's silhouette was visible against the starlight. Around 4 a.m., the attacks began. It started with voices, dozens of them, calling to us from every direction. I heard my own mother's voice begging me to open the door. Elena heard her sister, supposedly calling from Colorado with news of a family emergency. We heard Sheriff Damien, deputies Chase and George, even people who should have been hundreds of miles away. But we didn't respond. We couldn't. Because mixed in with the familiar voices were others, people we'd never met, speaking in languages we didn't recognize, calling out names that had no meaning to us. The things outside were losing focus, cycling through every voice they'd ever stolen without discrimination. Then came the physical attacks. Something struck the building's north wall with enough force to shake the entire structure. Then the south wall. Then the windows, testing each one with methodical precision. Glass cracked but didn't break. The windows were reinforced, designed to withstand the occasional flash flood that roared through the desert. They're looking for weak points, Elena observed. They won't find any. This place is built on sacred ground. How can you be sure? I pulled out my cell phone and showed her a photo I'd taken earlier that evening, before our world had turned into a nightmare. It was a picture of the visitor center's information plaque, describing the area's cultural significance to local Native American tribes. The Yavapai and Apache peoples considered this area a place of power, I read aloud. Traditional stories speak of it as neutral ground, where no violence could occur. Early settlers reported that even warring tribes would lay down their weapons when they entered this valley. A tremendous crash shook the building, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. They were on the roof now, testing the structural integrity of everything above us. How long until sunrise? Elena asked. I checked my watch. 2 hours. Will sunrise help? I don't know. My grandmother's stories were never clear about that. Sometimes the monsters retreated at dawn. Sometimes they didn't. Another crash. This one accompanied by the sound of tearing metal. A section of roofing had been peeled back, and through the gap I could see stars, and shapes moving against them, blocking out constellations as they passed overhead. They're coming through the roof, Elena said. I grabbed my pack and pulled out the remaining herbs Harrison had given me. Help me spread these around the room. Make a complete circle. We scattered the sacred mixture across the floor, creating a protective barrier in the center of the exhibit hall. The scent was stronger now. Sage and sweetgrass and something else that seemed to clear my head and steady my nerves. That's when the first one dropped through the hole in the roof. It landed in the far corner of the room, silent as a cat despite what must have been a 20-foot drop. In the dim emergency lighting it looked human. A middle-aged man in civilian clothes, perhaps a hiker who'd been caught by the pack earlier in the week. Help me, it said in a perfectly normal voice. Please, I'm hurt. I've been running all night. Elena kept her weapon trained on it, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The thing looked completely human. Frightened, exhausted, desperate. If I hadn't watched Cole die and then seen his doppelganger circling our refuge, I might have believed it myself. What's your name? I asked. Tristan. Tristan Walker. I was camping at Oak Creek when they attacked. Everyone else is dead. The thing took a step closer, favoring its left leg as if injured. Please, I just want to go home. Tristan, Elena said carefully. Can you tell us what day it is? The thing smiled. A warm, grateful expression that looked completely genuine. Thursday the 18th. Thank God you're here. I thought I was going to die out there. It was Saturday the 20th. Elena pulled the trigger 3 times, center mass. The bullets struck the creature and passed through without effect, embedding themselves in the wall behind it. The thing looked down at its chest with mild curiosity, as if wondering where the blood should be. That wasn't very nice, it said in Tristan's voice. Then it began to change. The human features melted away like wax, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process completely. I caught glimpses, too many joints, skin that wasn't quite skin, eyes that reflected light like mirrors, before my vision blurred and nausea overwhelmed me. Elena grabbed my arm and dragged me backward into the herb circle. The moment we crossed the barrier, the creature stopped its advance. It paced around the perimeter like a caged animal, testing the boundary but unable to cross it. Interesting, it said. And now its voice was something between human speech and the sound of wind through dry leaves. Old magic. older than my kind. We remember when your grandmother's people first learned to use such protections. What do you want? I asked. What we have always wanted. To feed, to grow strong, to reclaim the world from the soft things that have forgotten how to be afraid. The creature settled back on its haunches, adopting an almost conversational pose. Your people built cities, believing walls could protect them. They made laws, believing rules could bind us. They forgot that there are older laws, older hungers. More shapes dropped through the hole in the roof. 5, then 6, then too many to count. They formed a circle around our protective barrier, their borrowed faces shifting and changing like reflections in disturbed water. Why now? Elena asked. Why come out of hiding? One of them, wearing Sheriff Damien's face but speaking in a child's voice, answered. Because someone called us. Someone with knowledge, someone who remembered the old ways. They offered us a bargain. What kind of bargain? Fresh hunting grounds in exchange for services. They wanted certain people eliminated, certain areas cleared. They thought they could control us. The thing that had been Tristan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. They thought we were weapons that could be aimed and fired. But you're not. We are hunger given form. We take what we want, when we want it. And what we want now is to feed until the fear returns to your kind, until you remember what it means to be prey. I looked at my watch. 1 hour until dawn. The protective circle would hold, I was certain of that. But what happened when the sun came up? Would they retreat, or would they simply wait for us to emerge? The answer came from an unexpected source. My radio, which had been silent since we'd reached the visitor center, suddenly crackled to life. But instead of a human voice, it emitted a sound like static mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the wind through pine trees, of water flowing over stone. The creatures around our circle reacted immediately, their borrowed faces turning toward the sound with what looked like fear. No, one of them whispered. Not now. We're not ready. The static resolved into something that might have been a voice, ancient, speaking in a language that predated English by thousands of years. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning seemed to flow directly into my mind. The compact is broken. The boundaries are restored. Return to the shadow places. The things that had been hunting us began to retreat, backing away from our circle with obvious reluctance. But they weren't moving toward the hole in the roof. They were fading, becoming translucent, dissolving into the shadows cast by the emergency lighting. This isn't over, the Tristan thing said as it became little more than a whisper in the air. The one who called us still lives. The bargain can be renewed. Within minutes we were alone in the damaged visitor center. The radio fell silent, leaving only the normal sounds of the desert night, insects chirping, small animals moving through the brush, the distant howl of actual coyotes. Elena looked at me with exhausted eyes. What just happened? I tried to organize my thoughts. I think there are older powers in this land, things that were here before the skinwalkers, before the tribes, before anything human, and I think they just reasserted their authority. We waited until full sunrise before leaving the visitor center. The desert looked normal in daylight, beautiful, peaceful, showing no signs of the nightmare we'd endured. But I noticed that the wildlife was still absent, and the air had a charged quality that reminded me of the moments before a thunderstorm. Elena's radio worked now, connecting us with the state police dispatcher in Flagstaff. Search and rescue teams were already mobilizing to look for the missing officers and civilians. I gave them coordinates for where we'd last seen Cole, though I didn't mention what we'd really encountered in the darkness. As we waited for pickup, Elena asked the question I'd been dreading. What did that thing mean about someone calling them? Someone who made a bargain. I thought about the surgical precision of the cattle killings, about the timing of the attacks, about the coordinated nature of the hunt. Someone with knowledge of the old ways, someone who knew how to contact them and thought they could control what happened next. Any ideas who? Before I could answer, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar. This is Dr. Lewis Haley from the Biological Survey Institute, the man said. I understand you've had some unusual wildlife incidents in your area. I'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss our ongoing research into anomalous predator behavior. I exchanged a look with Elena. The Biological Survey Institute was a front organization. I'd heard rumors about government groups that investigated things that didn't fit into conventional categories. Dr. Haley, I said carefully, what makes you think our incidents are connected to your research? Let's just say we've been monitoring certain activities in the Four Corners region. Activities that suggest someone has been attempting to weaponize indigenous folklore for purposes that go far beyond academic study. The pieces began falling into place. Someone with government connections, someone with access to classified research, someone who thought they could turn ancient horrors into controllable assets. Where would you like to meet? I asked. There's a diner in Flagstaff. Barrett's Family Restaurant, on Route 66. Can you be there this afternoon? Barrett's. The same last name as the deputy whose voice we'd heard on the radio. The deputy who'd been dead for 3 years. I was beginning to understand that last night had been just the beginning. We'll be there, I said. As the rescue helicopter appeared on the horizon, Elena grabbed my arm. Are you sure about this? Meeting with some mysterious government scientist? I touched my grandmother's pendant, feeling its familiar warmth. Someone called those things out of the shadows. Someone made a deal that put innocent people in danger. We need to find out who, and then what. I looked out at the desert, at the ancient landscape that held so many secrets in its red rocks and hidden canyons. Somewhere out there, the skinwalkers were waiting in the shadow places, ready to resume their hunt if the opportunity arose. Then we make sure it never happens again. The helicopter landed in a swirl of dust and noise, but as we climbed aboard I could have sworn I heard something else. A voice carried on the wind, speaking in my grandmother's language, offering a blessing for the road ahead. The hunt was over, but our real work was just beginning. Living in Oak Ridge Heights hasn't been particularly remarkable for a 17-year-old like me. The suburban monotony would have been unbearable if not for my private sanctuary. A small, forgotten patch of woods sandwiched between our neighborhood and the highway bypass. Most people avoid it, thinking it's too small to be worth exploring or too close to the road to be peaceful. Their oversight has become my privilege. Every day after school I follow the same ritual. I slip out our back door, cut through Mrs. Wilson's neglected garden. She's too elderly to maintain it anymore and doesn't mind my shortcut, and within 5 minutes I'm at the entrance to my wooded haven. It's nothing spectacular, maybe 15 acres at most, but the trees grow dense enough to muffle the distant traffic and create the illusion of wilderness. I'm what you might call a practiced loner. Making friends has never come easily to me, and high school hasn't improved matters. The woods became my confidant, the place where I shed the forced smiles and awkward silences that define my school days. I've mapped every trail, memorized the location of every distinctive tree, and claimed a particular fallen log as my thinking spot. April 16th started like any other Tuesday. The sky hung overcast, threatening rain but withholding it, casting the world in a flat, gray light. School had been particularly draining. 2 surprise quizzes, a mandatory pep rally for a sport I couldn't care less about, and lunch spent avoiding the tables of chattering classmates who never seemed to notice my absence. By 3 o'clock I felt the familiar itch beneath my skin, the need to escape into solitude. I rushed home, changed into my usual outfit, worn jeans, a navy hoodie, and mud-caked hiking boots that had seen better days, and grabbed my backpack with the essentials, water bottle, sketchbook, and a granola bar. Back by dinner, I called out to my mother, who barely looked up from her laptop where she was finishing work projects. She raised a hand in acknowledgement, used to my afternoon disappearances. The damp air carried the scent of approaching rain as I navigated the entrance path, fallen leaves compacted from years of my solitary footsteps. I pushed my earbuds in, scrolling through my phone until finding a true crime podcast, background noise to accompany my thoughts. The familiar embrace of the woods welcomed me, branches creating a canopy overhead that darkened the already gloomy afternoon. Something about the quality of light that day made the shadows deeper, the silence between podcast segments more pronounced. But I dismissed the sensation, chalking it up to the weather and my already sour mood. I couldn't have known that this ordinary Tuesday would become the dividing line in my life, the before and after. That the woods I thought I knew would reveal something that would haunt my every waking moment and turn my dreams into nightmares that left me gasping in the dark. The first raindrops began to fall, pattering against the leaves above me as I ventured deeper into the trees, following a path I could have walked blindfolded. About 20 minutes into my walk, I decided to deviate from my usual route. A recent rainstorm had toppled a large oak, creating a new clearing I hadn't fully explored. The podcast in my ears had shifted to an advertisement break, so I lowered the volume and focused on navigating the uneven ground, stepping carefully over exposed roots and fallen branches. The new clearing had transformed since my last visit. Spring had brought a carpet of tiny white wildflowers and an explosion of mushrooms thriving in the damp conditions. I knelt to examine a particularly interesting cluster of fungi, their caps of vibrant orange against the dark soil. My biology teacher might appreciate a photo for extra credit. Rising to my feet, I decided to circle the entire fallen tree before heading to my usual spot. That's when my foot connected with something that immediately registered as wrong. The texture beneath my boot wasn't the springy forest floor or the crunch of dead leaves. Instead, it yielded in a way that sent immediate signals of alarm through my nervous system. The sensation was unmistakably like stepping on flesh. I yanked my foot back instinctively, stumbling backward and nearly falling. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I tore my earbuds out, suddenly needing all my senses alert. The forest sounds rushed in, birds, distant traffic, the soft patter of increasing rain, but they seemed distant compared to the blood pulsing in my ears. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to look down at what I'd stepped on. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. There, partially obscured by fallen leaves and perfectly integrated with the surrounding soil, was a human face, not a mask, not a doll. A face, with detailed features emerging from the earth itself, as if someone had been buried vertically with only their face pressing against the surface. The craftsmanship was impossible. Every detail was rendered with photographic precision. Pores, the slight asymmetry of natural features, even fine wrinkles around the closed eyes. The coloration matched the surrounding dirt perfectly. Yet the textures shifted subtly across the features, smoother across the forehead, slightly rougher along the jawline. My footprint had left an impression on what appeared to be the cheek, but instead of staying compressed like soil should, the imprint was already reforming, the surface slowly returning to its original shape like flesh bouncing back after pressure. I crouched down, my curiosity momentarily overriding my fear. The face appeared to belong to a middle-aged man, his expression serene, almost as if sleeping. No signs of distress marked his features, just peaceful repose. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling immediately foolish. It wasn't a person, it couldn't be, yet it was so lifelike that addressing it seemed natural, against every instinct screaming at me to run. I reached out one trembling finger and touched the forehead. It was warm. Not sun-warmed soil warm, but body temperature warm. And the texture, God, the texture was unmistakably skin, slightly moist, with the subtle elasticity of living tissue. When the eyelids flickered, time seemed to stop. A minute movement, just the faintest tremor beneath the soil-colored lids, but unmistakable. And then, horrifyingly, the lips parted slightly, releasing a soft exhalation of air that stirred the nearby leaves. Terror exploded through me. A scream tore from my throat, echoing through the trees and scattering nearby birds from their perches. I scrambled backward, my hands and feet slipping on wet leaves as I struggled to put distance between myself and the impossible face. Once upright, I ran. Branches whipped against my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. My backpack bounced painfully against my spine, and my abandoned earbuds dangled from my pocket, the tinny sound of the podcast still playing, creating a surreal soundtrack to my flight. The upbeat voice discussing murder statistics felt like a twisted joke as I fled from something I couldn't begin to comprehend. I burst through our back door at 4:17 p.m. I remember checking my phone with shaking hands, trying to ground myself in something normal. The 17 minutes since my discovery felt like hours. My mother looked up from her laptop, alarm spreading across her face as she took in my appearance. I must have been a sight, clothes muddied from my frantic escape, face scratched from branches, eyes wild with panic. "What happened?" She pushed back from the dining table, knocking over her coffee mug in her rush to reach me. Words failed me initially. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd touched? Eventually I managed to stammer out fragments. "The woods. There's a face. In the ground. I touched it. It moved." "Slow down," she said, guiding me to a chair. Deep breaths. "What face?" "In the dirt. A human face, like someone buried vertically with just their face showing. But it's part of the ground somehow." The words sounded insane even as I spoke them. I stepped on it by accident, and it felt like skin. Warm skin. My mother's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. "You probably saw an animal partially buried, or maybe some trash someone dumped that looked human-shaped." "No." I was adamant, the sensation of that warm flesh beneath my fingertip impossible to dismiss. "I know what I saw, what I touched." It blinked, Mom. Its lips moved. She studied my face, clearly trying to decide how to handle what she perceived as either a delusion or an overactive imagination. "Did you take any pictures?" she finally asked. The question hit me like a slap. Of course, my phone had been in my pocket the entire time. Why hadn't I documented it? I panicked, I admitted. I just ran. "Well," she said, her voice taking on that carefully measured tone adults use when humoring someone. "Let's go look at it together tomorrow, in the daylight. If there's something strange out there, we should report it." I nodded, though the prospect of returning filled me with dread. We agreed to check after she finished work the next day. She insisted I shower and change, suggesting the physical routine would help calm my nerves. Later that evening, as we ate dinner in uncomfortable silence, I could feel her watching me, concerned. I picked at my food, appetite gone, my mind replaying the encounter in endless loops. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, sometimes still, sometimes with eyes wide open and staring directly at me. Around 3 a.m. I gave up and sat at my desk, sketching what I'd seen with obsessive detail. By dawn, my trash can overflowed with crumpled attempts, none capturing the uncanny realism of what I'd encountered. I skipped school the next day, claiming illness. My mother, still worried, didn't argue. She worked from home, checking on me periodically. I spent the hours researching online, searching for anything similar to what I'd experienced. Archaeological discoveries, art installations, optical illusions, nothing matched the visceral reality of what I'd found. By afternoon, I'd convinced myself that returning with my mother would validate my experience. The face would still be there, and an adult would witness it, making it real beyond my own perception. As the time approached to head into the woods, anxiety knotted my stomach. Part of me feared finding nothing, making me question my sanity. But a deeper fear lurked beneath, the dread of finding the face again, of watching my mother touch it and seeing the horror I felt reflected in her eyes. At 5:30 p.m., my mother and I stood at the edge of the woods. The rain had stopped, but the ground remained soggy, mud sucking at our boots. Mom had brought a small garden trowel and flashlight, though the daylight would last for at least another hour. "Lead the way," she said, her tone gentle but tinged with the same voice she used when checking for monsters under my bed when I was 6. The woods felt different. Hostile somehow, as if resentful of my return with another person. Trees that had always seemed welcoming now loomed ominously, their branches reaching toward us like gnarled fingers. I navigated carefully, trying to recreate my path from the previous day. Everything looked both familiar and strangely altered, landmarks shifted or obscured by shadows. "It was near the fallen oak," I said, more to myself than to my mother. There was a patch of orange mushrooms nearby. After 15 minutes of increasingly frustrated searching, we found the clearing with the toppled tree. The orange mushrooms were there, just as I remembered. My heartbeat accelerated as I approached the area where the face should have been. Nothing, just ordinary forest floor. Leaves, twigs, patches of moss, and loose soil. No face, no impression, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. "This is the spot," I insisted, dropping to my knees and beginning to brush aside leaves frantically. "It was right here. I swear it was right here." My mother stood silent, watching my desperate search. Finally, she knelt beside me and put a hand on my shoulder. "The ground is very wet from the rain. Maybe whatever you saw got washed away or covered by runoff." I shook my head violently. "That's not possible. It was like integrated into the ground, part of it." I looked up at her, pleading. "I'm not making this up." She handed me the trowel. "Let's dig a bit. Maybe there's something underneath." For the next 30 minutes, we excavated the area, first carefully, then with increasing desperation on my part. We found nothing but normal forest soil, roots, and the occasional earthworm. No evidence of anything unusual, certainly nothing resembling human remains or an art installation. As daylight began to fade, my mother gently suggested we head home. "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us," she offered, "especially in places like forests where the lighting can be tricky and there are lots of organic shapes that can look like other things." I wanted to argue, to insist on the reality of what I'd experienced, but the evidence, or lack thereof, made my position increasingly untenable. Had I hallucinated the entire thing? Was I having some kind of breakdown? Reluctantly, I followed her home, glancing back repeatedly at the unremarkable patch of ground that had upended my sense of reality. That night, dinner was even more strained than the previous evening. My mother tried to lighten the mood, suggesting that stress from school was getting to me and offering to schedule an appointment with Dr. Rivera, our family physician. "I'm not sick," I insisted. "And I'm not crazy." "I never said you were," she replied. But her eyes told a different story. Concern mixed with something else. Worry about my mental state. After dinner, I retreated to my room, avoiding the stack of sketches I'd made. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and fell into a research hole, reading about pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in random objects, and various stress-induced hallucinations. None of the explanations satisfied me. They couldn't account for the tactile sensation of warm flesh, the movement of features. Whatever I'd encountered had been real. The question was, what exactly was it, and why had it disappeared? I fell asleep, still searching for answers, my laptop open beside me, screen illuminating my troubled face in the darkness. Days passed, melting into weeks. On the surface, I returned to normal routines, attending school, doing homework, maintaining the facade of ordinary teenage life. But internally, I remained fixated on what I'd experienced in the woods. I stopped taking my daily walks, both yearning for and dreading the forest. Instead, I channeled my obsession into research, staying late at the school library to access databases my home internet couldn't reach. I scoured archaeological journals for mentions of strange ground formations, studied geological phenomena that might explain what I'd seen, even delved into local history for stories of similar encounters. My grades began to suffer. Teachers emailed my mother about my declining participation and incomplete assignments. Friends, the few I had, stopped inviting me to weekend gatherings after I repeatedly declined. Too consumed by my research to socialize, my mother watched me with increasing concern. I overheard her on the phone one night, speaking in hushed tones to my aunt. "I'm worried about him. Ever since that day in the woods, he's different. Obsessed with this face he thinks he saw. Should I take him to someone? A therapist, maybe?" The suggestion that I needed psychological help rankled, but I understood her perspective. Without evidence, my experience sounded delusional. Sometimes, in moments of clarity, I questioned my own memory. Maybe it had been a vivid hallucination triggered by stress or exhaustion. But then the dreams began. They always started the same way. Me walking in the woods, following my familiar path. But instead of one face, the entire forest floor became a mosaic of faces, hundreds of them, all with eyes closed, all breathing in unison, the ground itself rising and falling like a sleeping giant's chest. In the dream I would kneel to touch one, and all the eyes would open simultaneously, fixing me with the same penetrating stare. I started avoiding sleep, staying up until exhaustion claimed me, then waking drenched in sweat, the echo of those watching eyes lingering in my consciousness. By the third week I had filled 2 notebooks with theories and questions. The most compelling involved a phenomenon called earth art, installations where artists create sculptures integrated with natural landscapes. But even this explanation fell short. No artist could create something with the organic warmth and movement I'd experienced. My mother's patience wore thin as my obsession deepened. One evening, after finding me asleep amid a scattered array of printouts about geological anomalies, she confronted me directly. "This has gone far enough," she said, gathering my research papers. "You need to let this go. Whatever you think you saw, face or not, it's consuming you. I can't just forget it," I protested, reaching for my notes. "You can, and you will," she replied firmly. "I'm calling Dr. Rivera tomorrow, and I want you to talk to someone professional about this fixation." That night I lay awake, staring at my ceiling, torn between anger at not being believed and fear that perhaps I truly was losing my grip on reality. What if there was nothing in those woods? What if my mind had manufactured the entire experience? But as dawn approached and exhaustion finally pulled me toward sleep, a new and terrifying thought surfaced. What if the face was real, but had deliberately disappeared when I brought my mother? What if it wanted only me to see it? And what if it was waiting for me to return alone? 37 days after my initial encounter, I forced myself to return to the woods. My mother, believing my obsession had finally subsided after 2 sessions with a therapist, during which I carefully avoided mentioning the face, instead discussing general school stress, had relaxed her vigilance. The forest welcomed me with familiar scents of decomposing leaves and damp earth. Spring had fully arrived, carpeting the ground with new growth and shifting the quality of light as it filtered through fresh green canopy. I deliberately avoided the fallen oak, instead taking a different path that looped around the western edge of the woods. My senses remained hyper-alert, scanning the ground for anything unusual, my body tense with anticipation and dread. Nothing seemed amiss until I reached a small stream that divided the property, little more than a trickle most times of year, swollen slightly from recent rains. As I prepared to step across using the familiar stone crossing, something in the water caught my attention. At first I thought it was just ripples distorting my reflection, but as I stared more intently, the water seemed to organize itself into a pattern that unmistakably resembled human features: eyes, nose, mouth, formed by the way light played across the surface and the arrangement of pebbles beneath. Coincidence, I whispered to myself. Pareidolia. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the water face seemed to gain definition, becoming more distinct rather than dissolving under scrutiny. And like the earth face before it, this watery visage possessed an impossible level of detail. The subtle curve of lips, the precise shape of nostrils, even the suggestion of eyelashes where water rippled against the bank. My heart hammered as I crouched for a closer look. Unlike the previous face, this one's eyes were open, not staring at me, but gazing skyward. The pupils formed by particularly dark pebbles beneath the surface, fighting against every instinct urging retreat. I reached toward the water, wondering if this apparition would also possess impossible physical properties. The moment my fingertips broke the surface, the face dissolved, water ripples destroying the perfect arrangement. But something brushed against my hand, not the expected cold current, but something soft and warm that seemed to recede from my touch. I yanked my hand back, water droplets flying. For several minutes I stared at the stream, but the face didn't reform, just ordinary water flowing over ordinary stones. Backing away from the stream, I surveyed my surroundings with new awareness. The woods suddenly seemed alive in a way that transcended normal forest vitality. The patterns of bark on nearby trees, the arrangement of branches against the sky, the distribution of moss across fallen logs, all seemed deliberately organized, containing half-formed suggestions of faces that appeared and disappeared depending on the angle of observation. I spent hours documenting everything in my notebook, sketching patterns, recording locations. A hypothesis began to form, not about buried bodies or art installations, but something far more disturbing. The forest itself was generating these faces, as if the entire ecosystem were somehow conscious and attempting communication through familiar human patterns. The sun began to set as I made my final notes. As darkness descended, the forest's threatening aura intensified. Shadows deepened between trees, and ordinary night sounds, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the distant hoot of owls, took on sinister overtones. Making my way back toward home, I passed the fallen oak. Despite my earlier avoidance, some compulsion drew me to check the spot where I'd originally found the face. The area remained unremarkable in the fading light, just soil and leaf litter. But as I turned to leave, the ground behind me released a soft exhalation, like a long-held breath finally released. I ran the rest of the way home. My therapist calls it a controlled exposure, returning to the source of trauma as a way of processing and moving beyond it. But there was nothing controlled about my decision to spend the night in the woods 53 days after my initial encounter. I told my mother I was staying at a friend's house to work on a school project. She seemed pleased by this sign of normalcy, this evidence that I was reconnecting with peers and focusing on academics again. The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. I packed carefully: flashlight, extra batteries, water, protein bars, sleeping bag, first aid kit, and my phone fully charged, camera function easily accessible. This time, I would document everything. Twilight was fading into true darkness as I reached the woods. Setting up my small camp near, but not too near, the fallen oak, I prepared for a long night of observation. The forest seemed to acknowledge my presence with subtle shifts in its ambient sounds. Birds falling silent, insects intensifying their chorus, branches creaking despite the absence of wind. Hours passed. I alternated between scanning my surroundings and documenting my observations in a new notebook. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed movement at the periphery of my vision, shadows that moved independently, arrangements of leaves that momentarily formed recognizable patterns before dissolving back into random natural debris. Around midnight, exhaustion began to claim me despite my determination to remain alert. My notes became disjointed, thoughts trailing off mid-sentence as my eyelids grew heavy. I must have dozed because the sound that jolted me awake, a wet, disturbing noise like mud being slowly displaced, seemed to come from everywhere at once. Opening my eyes, I found myself in absolute darkness. My flashlight, which I'd left on, lay dark beside me. Fumbling with the switch produced nothing. Dead batteries? Impossible. They were brand new. My phone showed the same problem, fully charged when I'd last checked, now completely unresponsive. The noise continued, growing louder, a rhythmic squelching that reminded me horribly of a mouth opening and closing in thick mud. It seemed to surround my small camp, coming from all directions simultaneously. Rising to my knees, I strained to see anything in the heavy darkness. The moon provided minimal illumination through the canopy, just enough to distinguish the silhouettes of trees against the marginally lighter sky. "Hello," I called out, my voice embarrassingly small. "Is someone there?" The squelching sound stopped immediately. The ensuing silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. A listening silence, attentive and evaluating. Then the ground beneath my sleeping bag shifted, not like an earthquake or natural settlement, more like something large turning over beneath the surface. My entire body tensed as I felt the earth rise slightly beneath me, forming subtle contours that pressed against my legs and back. I scrambled off my sleeping bag, heart threatening to burst from my chest. Using what little moonlight filtered through the leaves, I could see that the ground where I'd been lying was changing, the surface rippling and organizing itself into unmistakable patterns. Faces. Dozens of them. Not just one isolated visage like before, but an entire section of forest floor transforming into a mosaic of human features. Men, women, various ages and expressions, all rendered in perfect detail despite being formed from nothing but soil and leaf litter. Their eyes remained closed, but their mouths moved in silent unison, opening and closing with those terrible wet sounds I'd heard earlier. Some turned their heads slightly, adjusting their positions as if seeking comfort beneath the surface. I stood frozen, unable to run, unable even to scream. My brain struggled to process what my eyes were witnessing, an impossibility made horrifyingly real. Then, as one, all the eyes opened. Dozens of gazes fixed on me, pupils contracting in the dim light just as human eyes would. Some blinked, others stared unwaveringly. All possessed the same unsettling awareness, the same terrible intelligence. One face, positioned directly where my sleeping bag had been, spoke. Not in words exactly, but its mouth formed shapes that somehow translated into meaning in my mind. "We have been waiting for you to return." The voice wasn't audible in the conventional sense. Rather, it resonated directly in my thoughts, bypassing my ears entirely. The sensation was invasive, intimate in a way that felt deeply violating. "What are you?" I managed to whisper. The faces shifted, some smiling slightly, others maintaining neutral expressions. The one that had spoken replied, "We are the foundation, the witness, the memory." "Human?" I asked, though I already knew the answer was both yes and no. "Once," came the reply. "Now part of something greater." Other faces began to speak, their thought voices overlapping in my mind, creating a dizzying chorus of communication. Images flashed through my consciousness. Centuries of forest history compressed into seconds, generations of humans who had walked these grounds, lives and deaths witnessed by the patient earth. I glimpsed terrible knowledge in those mental transmissions, hints of what happened to those who became one with this strange consciousness, the slow dissolution of individual identity as they merged with the greater awareness that permeated the soil. Most disturbing were the glimpses of how new faces joined this collective, not through death alone, but through a gradual claiming, a persistent invitation extended to those the forest deemed receptive. Those like me, who walked alone among the trees, who felt more connection to nature than to human society. "You called to us," one face said, its features remarkably similar to my own. "Your solitude, your longing," we answered. The ground around me continued to transform, more faces emerging, the circle closing. I realized with horror that they were creating a space for me, a me-shaped depression in the earth where I would fit perfectly. "Join us," they intoned in unison. "Become foundation, become witness, become memory." The earth beneath my feet softened, beginning to pull at my boots like quicksand. Panic exploded through me, breaking the paralysis that had gripped me during this impossible exchange. I ran, feet tearing free from the grasping soil with sickening suction sounds. Behind me, a chorus of disappointed sighs rose from dozens of earthen throats. Branches whipped my face as I fled blindly through darkness, the path invisible, direction meaningless, just away from those watching eyes and beckoning voices. Several times I fell, each contact with the ground bringing renewed terror that the soil would form around me, claim me. Somehow, I found the edge of the woods. Moonlight revealed the welcome sight of houses beyond the tree line. Safety, normality, human spaces where earth stayed inanimate and soil didn't speak with borrowed faces. As I crossed that boundary, my phone suddenly chimed to life in my pocket. Battery miraculous, restored to full power. Notifications cascaded across the screen, missed calls from my mother, messages asking where I was, why I wasn't answering. Looking back at the dark mass of trees, I saw nothing pursuing me, just an ordinary forest on an ordinary night. But I knew what waited within, patient and persistent, what would always be waiting, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that part of me wanted to return. 3 months have passed since that night. I've moved through summer in a daze, going through the motions of normal life, while carrying the weight of what I know, what I've seen and heard and felt. My mother worries less now. The therapist has officially diagnosed me with an anxiety disorder with transient stress-induced perceptual abnormalities. The medication they prescribe doesn't change what I know to be true, but it dulls the constant fear enough that I can function, can pretend to be the person I was before. I haven't returned to the woods, not physically, but in dreams I walk beneath those trees nightly, discovering new faces and streams, tree bark, arrangements of fallen leaves. Sometimes I wake convinced that my bedroom floor is shifting beneath my bed, organizing itself into watching eyes and listening mouths. The compulsion to return grows stronger each day. An ache like homesickness, though what calls to me isn't home but its opposite, dissolution, surrendering my discrete self to become part of something vast and ancient. I've researched obsessively, searching for similar accounts throughout history. I've found fragments, myths of earth deities who claim humans, folklore about forests that consume travelers, modern disappearances in wooded areas that were never solved. The pattern seems clear now. Certain places develop a consciousness over time, an awareness that spreads through soil and root systems, that remembers and learns and eventually desires communion with the human minds that move through its domain. And once it notices you, once it recognizes your receptiveness, it never stops calling. I've taken to wearing headphones constantly, filling my ears with music or podcasts or audiobooks, anything to drown out the whispers that seem to emanate from houseplants, From the small patch of garden outside my window, from the very ground beneath the concrete foundations of our house. At night, I stuff towels along the bottom of my bedroom door to prevent soil from seeping in, a precaution my mother attributes to my contamination anxiety, but which I know is necessary. Twice I've woken to find dirt on my bedroom carpet, arranged in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Last week I found a small face forming in my mother's garden, just the suggestion of features pressing up through the tomato bed, but unmistakable to my trained eye. I destroyed it with a garden trowel before she could see it, digging until my hands blistered and the soil showed no further signs of organization. It's following me, reaching for me. Patient but persistent. Sometimes I wonder if resistance is merely postponing the inevitable. The faces in the woods spoke of witnesses and memory, of foundations and greater purpose. What if they weren't threatening me but offering transcendence? What if what waits in the soil isn't death but transformation? These thoughts terrify me most of all because they don't feel entirely like my own. They carry echoes of those thought voices that invaded my mind that night, subtle persuasion masquerading as insight. I've started recording everything. Writing this account, documenting each new manifestation, creating a record that might survive whatever happens to me. Because I'm increasingly certain that something will happen. The most recent development occurred yesterday. While brushing my teeth, I noticed something strange about my reflection. For just a moment, barely a second, my skin took on the texture and coloration of soil, my features resembling those earth faces from the woods. The impression vanished when I blinked, but the message was clear. The process has already begun. The forest has marked me, claimed me in some fundamental way that transcends physical proximity. Tonight I'll reinforce my windows and doors with salt lines. A superstition perhaps, but I'm beyond dismissing folklore as mere fantasy. I'll continue my medication, continue therapy, continue pretending that conventional treatment can address what ails me. But I know the truth, even if no one else will ever believe it. The earth is awake. It watches, it remembers, it waits, and somewhere in those woods, a space exactly my size and shape remains prepared, ready to receive me when my resistance finally breaks. A place where I will join countless others, becoming foundation, witness, memory, another face in the earth, watching through the ages as new solitary walkers pass overhead, unaware of what stirs beneath their feet, until one day, one of them steps exactly right, feels the giving warmth beneath their soul, and begins their own journey to understanding what waits beneath the surface of our world. I wonder if I'll still be me when that happens, or if I'll be part of the chorus that calls to them, invites them, welcomes them home. My name is Ethan Cooper, and I've worked as a park ranger for the past 12 years, patrolling remote wilderness areas across the country. It's a demanding job, often isolating, but the solitude and natural beauty drew me to it. Growing up in Michigan, I always felt at peace alone in the woods, far from the bustle of city life. Little did I know when I took this position how much danger I'd face out there on my own. I've been stationed in some of the most rugged parks and forests, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Oregon's Cascade Mountains, the dense woodlands of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. Every placement brought new challenges and threats, some of which still haunt me today. I remember my first real taste of fear on the job. It was my second year as a ranger, patrolling a vast state forest in northern Wisconsin. I set out on a routine hike to check trail conditions after a storm. About 3 miles in, an eerie feeling prickled the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the trees and listening intently. Branches creaked, leaves rustled, but no birds sang and no squirrels chattered. The forest was unnaturally silent. A twig snapped somewhere off the trail and I whirled toward the sound, unclipping the bear spray from my belt. Peering between the pines, I glimpsed a shadowy figure darting through the underbrush. The hairs stood up on my arms. I called out, identifying myself as a ranger, but was met with only silence. A ranger's greatest fear is encountering someone dangerous in the backcountry, miles from help. I hurried back to the trail and rushed toward the trailhead, bear spray in hand, looking back over my shoulder the whole way. I never saw the figure again, and no other hikers reported anything unusual. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brushed up against something sinister, watching me from the woods that day. It was the first of many inexplicable, unsettling incidents I'd experienced in my years as a ranger. Each one chipped away at my certainty that the dangers of the job were limited to the natural and explainable. Wild animals, harsh weather, careless humans. I began to suspect there were other, stranger threats lurking in the wilderness, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up in the heart of mountain forests, investigating the unexplained, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a childhood spent exploring the woods of Michigan. a young man searching for purpose, and a decision that would change the course of my life, for better or worse. I grew up in a small town in Michigan, on the edge of the Huron National Forest. My dad worked in an auto factory and my mom waited tables at a local diner. We didn't have much money, but we got by. What I remember most about my childhood is the freedom of endlessly roaming the woods behind our house. From the time I could walk, I spent hours every day wandering beneath those towering maples and hemlocks. I'd pack a lunch, grab my Swiss Army knife, and strike out in search of adventure. I bushwhacked new trails, built lean-tos from fallen branches, searched for Indian arrowheads, and imagined I was an early pioneer. Alone in the forest, I felt capable and at peace. As a teenager, I struggled in school, not from lack of smarts, but lack of motivation. I knew I'd never thrive in a desk job or a factory like my dad. I craved open spaces, fresh air, a physical challenge. I pored over books about famous explorers, mountaineers, and naturalists, dreaming of a life of adventure. When a ranger visited my high school and gave a presentation about working for the National Park Service, something in me ignited. I peppered the ranger with questions about his job, the places he'd been, the things he'd seen. And I decided, then and there, that I would become a ranger too. My parents weren't thrilled with the idea initially. They pictured low pay, no job security, and constant relocation to the middle of nowhere. Not exactly the stable future they envisioned for their son. But I was resolute. I studied hard to get my grades up, researched the requirements for federal law enforcement jobs, and got in great physical condition through hiking and rock climbing. To my surprise and joy, I was accepted into a Pathways Ranger trainee program right out of high school. I said goodbye to my hometown, my family, and my old life, and headed west for training. The adventures that awaited me, I could never have imagined. My first park ranger job was at Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It felt like coming full circle, back to the northern forests of my home state. I loved the work, maintaining trails, assisting hikers, giving interpretive talks on the area's stunning geography and local history. I even enjoyed the more mundane duties like cleaning pit toilets and painting signs. I was just thrilled to spend my days outdoors in some of the most beautiful places on Earth. But there was a darker side to the job that I was unprepared for. Rangers often work alone in remote areas, miles from backup. We're trained to handle everything from unruly drunk campers to aggressive bears. But there are some things out in the untamed wilderness that training can't prepare you for. Things that defy explanation. Things that make you question what's really out there in the shadows of the forest. It was at Pictured Rocks that I first began to learn about the old stories and the strange happenings in the woods, dark local legends I'd never heard as a kid, disappearances that were never solved, sightings of creatures that couldn't possibly exist. I shrugged them off at first, focusing on the job at hand. But I couldn't help feeling an ominous weight in the words of one grizzled old ranger, whispered to me around a late-night campfire my first season. You spend enough time out there in the deep woods, alone, you'll start to realize that the scary stories we tell, well, maybe they aren't just stories after all. That conversation planted a seed of unease that grew with each strange, unsettling incident I witnessed in the years that followed. After the success of my first season at Pictured Rocks, I was given the opportunity to transfer to other parks and forests around the country. Eager for new adventure, I jumped at the chance. Over the next few years, I crisscrossed the country, working everywhere from Oregon's Crater Lake to the Green Mountains of Vermont. I loved the variety of terrain and experiences. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the creeping sense that there was more to the wilderness than meets the eye. Some of my experiences were easily explainable, if chilling. There was the time I surprised a mother grizzly with her cubs in Montana and narrowly escaped becoming a big bear's lunch. There was the week I spent lost in the Adirondacks when my navigational equipment failed and a dense fog settled in the mountains. I survived by remembering my training, but there were some very cold, hungry, and uncertain nights. Other incidents were harder to make sense of, like the time I saw strange lights hovering over the trees in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania late one moonless night. Blue, white, and pulsing, they drifted in formation above the forest, then zipped away at impossible speed when I tried to get closer for a better look. I was never able to find an explanation. Or the night, deep in the Cascades of Oregon, I heard what sounded like screams echoing through the hills, long and undulating and almost human, but not quite. The hair stood up on the back of my neck as I tried to convince myself it was just a cougar or coyote. But some primal instinct told me otherwise. Even more chilling was the report from a terrified family staying at a remote Wisconsin campground. They claimed to have seen dark figures darting between the trees at night, circling their tent. Figures that seemed to stand upright like men, but were far too tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. The campers left their gear behind and fled, As a ranger, I'm trained to be a skeptic of such stories, but I couldn't help shuddering when I packed up their abandoned tent, remembering my own unsettling experience in those same woods years ago. Still, I tried to rationalize every strange occurrence, to focus on the job I loved and leave the ghost stories for late nights around the campfire. But as the years went on, the incidents piled up, and I found myself wondering more and more about the old legends I'd heard whispers of since my first days as a ranger. Stories I'd once dismissed as mere spooky campfire tales took on an uneasy weight. There were the Native American legends of shadow people who roamed the forests, the physical embodiments of loneliness and despair, the stories of humanoid creatures living deep in underground caves, surfacing only at night to snatch unwary prey. Even older were the tales of ancient nature spirits, neither human nor animal, that guarded the untouched reaches of the wilderness. Encounters with these beings rarely ended well for the humans involved. I'd always had a logical, scientific mindset. I put little stock in the supernatural or paranormal, but my experiences as a ranger made it harder and harder to discount the possibility that there were things in the deep forest that science couldn't easily explain, things that had roamed the woods since long before humans ever set foot there. And if the old legends were to be believed, these beings didn't take kindly to human intrusion into their domain. It all came to a head during my 5th season as a ranger. I was working in the rugged wilderness of Montana's Glacier National Park. It was early October, the tail end of the season. The tourists had largely departed, and the park felt emptier and wilder than ever. I'd been assigned to a backcountry patrol, monitoring trail conditions and preparing the more remote areas of the park for the winter closure. On the 3rd day of my patrol, I set out on a trail that wound deep into the Rocky Mountains, towards a glacial lake nestled in a hard-to-reach canyon. It was a challenging hike, but I was in peak physical condition and knew the route well. I left my truck at the trailhead and struck out, just after dawn, into air so crisp it almost crackled in my lungs. I made good time on the 10-mile trek into the canyon, stopping only briefly to snack on jerky and trail mix. I reached the shores of the lake by early afternoon, breathless from the final grueling uphill push. It was even more spectacular than I remembered, the clear blue waters reflecting the craggy peaks and golden aspens like a mirror. I had the unnerving sensation of the mountains looming over me, watching. I shook off the odd feeling, ate a quick lunch, and got to my tasks. I checked the trail for erosion or obstructions, packed out a few pieces of litter inconsiderate hikers had left behind, and jotted some notes on the lake's water level, which seemed a bit low. More worryingly, I saw no sign of the loons and ospreys that usually nested in the area. The place was eerily quiet and still, even for the shoulder season. With afternoon fading into dusk, and an uneasy feeling prickling the back of my neck, I decided to start my hike out, rather than make camp for the night as I'd originally planned. I shot a quick message on my satellite phone to the rangers back at headquarters, letting them know to expect me late that night rather than the next morning. The wind picked up as I retraced my route, sending golden aspen leaves swirling around me. The temperature plummeted with the setting sun. I zipped up my jacket and hurried my pace, wanting to make it below tree line before full dark. That's when I heard it, minus a low, guttural growl unlike anything I'd heard before. I froze, slowly unclipping my bear spray, searching the advancing shadows between the pines for the source of the sound. A large shape moved in the underbrush. It seemed to absorb what little light remained, a space of darkness against the dark forest. Something large, but not a bear. As my eyes adjusted, the shape resolved into a massive, humanoid figure. It stood on 2 legs, towering over me even from a distance. Shaggy fur or long hair hung from its body. Its face was strangely elongated, with glowing eyes and a mouth full of wickedly sharp teeth. My blood ran cold. Every old story, every strange encounter over the years, clicked into awful focus. I was looking at a creature that shouldn't exist outside of a campfire tale, but it was here, it was real, and it was slowly advancing on me, letting out another blood-chilling growl. My mind screamed at me to run, but some primal instinct kept me rooted to the spot, knowing that fleeing would only trigger this creature's predatory response. I slowly raised my bear spray, but my gut told me it would have little effect on this thing that was no earthly animal. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried desperately to recall what the old legends said about encountering these beings. Some stories said that singing could soothe angry spirits, that acknowledging their presence with soft words might grant safe passage. It seemed insane, but what did I have to lose? I began to sing a half-remembered song I'd learned from a Blackfoot elder at a campfire years ago, my voice trembling as I forced the ancient words out. The creature halted. I kept singing, dredging up what little I could recall of the strange melody. Miraculously, the creature seemed to settle back on its haunches. Its glowing eyes blinked slowly. When I finished my shaky song, it let out a huff of air, and melted back into the shadows. I stood there, astonished and shaken. Did that really just happen? Some academics claim that all the old legends have some basis in truth. Had I just had an encounter with the truth behind the tales of forest giants and mountain monsters? I waited until I was sure the creature was gone, then sprinted back down the trail as fast as my shaking legs could carry me. I made it back to my truck in half the time it had taken me to hike in, not stopping until I was within the reassuring confines of the vehicle with the doors locked. Only then did I let myself process what I'd seen. I sat there trembling, doubting my own sanity, until the adrenaline subsided enough for me to trust myself to drive. Back at Ranger headquarters, I wrestled with whether to make an official report of the incident. I had no proof beyond my own word. Even I might find the story ludicrous if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. In the end, I logged it vaguely as encountering signs of a large, unidentified animal. But I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. If these creatures were really out there, people needed to know, didn't they? That question ate at me in the weeks and months that followed. I threw myself into research, scouring folklore archives and talking to every tribal elder who would meet with me. I found dozens of stories that aligned with what I'd seen, hundreds of historical accounts of encounters with massive, shadowy figures in the woods across North America and beyond. But for every old tale, there was a gap in the modern record. No clear photos, no physical evidence, no concrete proof that these creatures existed outside of campfire tales. I began to feel like I was chasing ghosts and fairy stories, and yet I couldn't let it go. I'd seen something that defied logical explanation. And once you've seen that, you can never quite look at the world the same way again. I knew I had to keep searching for answers, even if it meant plunging into the dark heart of the forest, where old legends still stalk the shadows. In the years following my encounter in Glacier, I became increasingly obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the legends. Every spare moment was spent poring over old books, interviewing elders, and venturing into the wildest reaches of every park and forest I worked in, searching for any sign or clue that might validate what I'd seen. But the demands of the job and my single-minded obsession began to take a toll. I was reprimanded for hiking off-trail in pursuit of some flimsy lid. I frightened a group of campers with intense questions about a strange sighting. My supervisors started to question my fitness for duty, given my preoccupation with the paranormal, but I couldn't stop. I felt like I was on the cusp of a revelation. If I could just find that key piece of evidence, my personal life suffered too. I'd always been a bit of a loner, content with my own thoughts and the company of the forest, but my quest made me more isolated than ever. I stopped calling my parents, not wanting to hear the concern in their voices. The few friends I had drifted away, put off by my incessant chatter about monsters and conspiracies. Even my beloved woods started to feel more menacing than comforting. This all came to a head when I was in the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. I'd been following up on a rash of strange sightings in the area, hikers reporting glimpses of impossibly tall, shadowy figures lurking off-trail. One particularly unnerving account described a nighttime encounter with a creature that seemed to absorb light, with eyes that glowed an unearthly green. It was enough to send me on yet another ill-advised, solo expedition into the backcountry. I hiked for miles, venturing deeper into the wilderness than I ever had before, driven by a desperate need to find answers. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows between the trees growing darker and more ominous with each step. I told myself it was just my imagination, that my obsession was making me paranoid. But the prickling sensation on the back of my neck wouldn't abate. As night fell, I set up a hasty camp in a small clearing, more focused on continuing my search than on practicalities like shelter or fire. I sat on a fallen log, feverishly scribbling notes and sketches in my battered journal by the light of my headlamp. The noises of the forest seemed amplified in the darkness, every snapping twig or rustling leaf making me jump. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees, far too close for comfort. I leapt to my feet, heart pounding, and swept my light across the clearing's edge. The beam caught a pair of glowing green eyes staring back at me from the underbrush, but they were far too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. I stood frozen, barely breathing, as a massive figure detached itself from the shadows and stepped into the clearing. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with shaggy fur and long, sinewy limbs that ended in wickedly curved claws. Its face was like something out of a nightmare, elongated and angular, with a mouthful of jagged teeth. I knew I should be terrified. I should run, or reach for my bear spray, or do any of the things I'd been trained to do in the face of a threat. But in that moment, all I felt was a thrill of vindication. After all these years, here was proof that I hadn't been chasing ghosts and shadows. The creatures of legend were real. The creature regarded me silently, its glowing eyes boring into mine with an intelligence that was chillingly human-like. Then, to my shock, It opened its mouth and spoke in a voice like grinding stones. "Why do you pursue us, human? Why can't you leave well enough alone?" I was so stunned that for a moment I couldn't find my voice. Here was a creature out of myth, asking me a question as casually as if we'd met on a park trail. When I finally managed to respond, my voice shook. I've been searching for the truth, trying to understand what I saw all those years ago. I didn't mean any harm, I had to know. The creature let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a sigh. "Your kind are always seeking knowledge you are not meant to have, meddling in affairs beyond your understanding. You risk much, human, in your reckless pursuit of our secrets." "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't realize." My mind was spinning, grappling with the enormity of this encounter. "Are there others like you? Have you always been here? What are you?" The creature huffed, baring its teeth in what might have been a smile or a threat. "We are the Watchers in the Wood, the guardians of the green places. We have walked these forests since long before your kind first laid eyes upon them, and we will remain long after you are gone." It leaned forward, voice dropping to a menacing rumble. "But our patience with your intrusions grows thin. Take your questions and be gone, human. Do not seek us out again." With that, the creature turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving me standing shell-shocked and alone in the dark. I barely slept that night, my mind a-whirl with the revelations of my encounter. At dawn, I packed up and hiked out of the back country in a daze. I knew I should feel elated. After all these years, I had confirmation that the legends were true. I'd spoken with one of the mythical beings I'd been chasing for so long, but the creature's warning weighed heavy on me. Had I gone too far in my obsessive quest? Had I put myself, and perhaps others, in danger with my reckless pursuit of the truth? I didn't have the answers, but one thing I knew for certain: my time as a park ranger, and my foray into the mysteries that lurked in the forest's shadows, had come to an end. It was time for me to leave the woods and their secrets behind, before I found myself entangled in something beyond my ability to comprehend or control. Leaving the ranger service wasn't an easy decision, but I knew in my gut it was the right one. I'd seen too much, gone too far down the rabbit hole of myth and mystery. I needed to clear my head, to gain some distance and perspective on the experiences that had consumed me for so long. I moved back to my hometown in Michigan, taking a job as a nature guide at a local state park. It wasn't the same thrill as being a backcountry ranger, but it kept me connected to the outdoors while giving me a much-needed sense of stability. I poured my energy into leading hikes, teaching kids about ecology, and generally trying to appreciate the woods for their own beauty again. Not as the lair of some dark secret, but the shadows of my past never fully receded. I'd lie awake at night, replaying my encounter with the creature over and over in my mind. I'd find myself scanning the tree line on hikes, half hoping and half dreading to catch a glimpse of something unnatural watching from the depths of the forest. As much as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that my time in the wild places had marked me in some fundamental way. And then the dreams started. Night after night, I'd find myself back in the mountains, wandering through mist-shrouded forests that seemed to shift and change around me. I'd hear whispers in the wind, catch fleeting glimpses of tall, shadowy figures darting between the trees. Sometimes I'd end up back in that clearing in the Great Smokies, face to face with the creature again. But instead of threatening me, it would simply stare at me with those glowing green eyes, as if trying to convey some message I couldn't quite grasp. I tried to dismiss the dreams as a product of stress and lingering obsession, but they felt so real, so vivid, that I couldn't help feeling they were trying to tell me something. That perhaps my time with the mysteries of the forest wasn't quite finished after all. This suspicion was confirmed when, about a year after I'd left the ranger service, I received a cryptic email from an address I didn't recognize. There was no subject line, and the body of the message contained only a set of GPS coordinates and a single line of text. "You are not the only one who knows the truth." I stared at the screen for a long time, pulse quickening. Was this some kind of trap? A prank from a former colleague who'd gotten wind of my obsessive quest? Or was it something else? A genuine lead from someone who'd had experiences like mine? Against my better judgment, I plugged the coordinates into a map. They pointed to a remote area in the Olympic Mountains of Washington State, a rugged wilderness I'd never explored during my time as a ranger. I knew I shouldn't go. I'd left that life behind for a reason, and chasing an anonymous email into the backcountry was the height of foolishness. But in my heart, I'd already made the decision. The questions that had driven me for so long still burned inside me. If there was even a chance of finding answers, of understanding the true nature of the creatures I'd encountered, I had to take it. I made my preparations in secret, not wanting to worry my family or friends. I booked a flight to Washington, assembled my backpacking gear, and crafted a plausible story about taking a solo hiking trip to clear my head. All the while, A voice in the back of my mind whispered that I was making a terrible mistake, that I was plunging headlong into something I didn't fully understand and might not be able to handle. But the pull of the unknown was too strong to resist. And so, on a misty morning in early autumn, I found myself standing at the edge of the Olympic wilderness, compass in hand and a strange mix of excitement and dread thrumming through my veins. I shouldered my pack, checked the coordinates one last time, and struck off into the forest, ready to face whatever truths or terrors awaited me in its green depths. The hike to the coordinates was grueling, even for someone in peak physical condition like myself. The Olympic Mountains are notoriously rugged, all dizzying ridges and plunging valleys cloaked in dense, primeval forest. I pushed myself hard, driven by a sense of urgency I couldn't quite explain. It felt as though I was racing against some unseen clock, that if I didn't reach my destination soon, I might lose my chance at answers forever. As I trekked deeper into the wilderness, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The feeling was different from my previous encounters with the creatures, less overtly menacing, but no less unsettling. It was as if the very forest was aware of my presence, observing my progress with a kind of ancient, inscrutable intelligence. On the evening of my second day in the mountains, I reached the GPS coordinates. They led me to a small hidden valley, so deep and narrow that the sun struggled to penetrate the canopy. A sense of hushed anticipation hung in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. At the center of the valley stood a massive, gnarled oak tree, its trunk so wide it would have taken a dozen people to encircle it with their arms. Something about the tree felt different, older, somehow, and imbued with a presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I approached, I saw that there was a hollow in the base of the trunk, a dark opening that seemed to beckon me forward. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, that I was walking into something I might not walk out of. But I'd come too far to turn away now. Steeling myself, I ducked into the hollow, stooping to fit through the low entrance. Inside was a small, dimly lit space that seemed to extend much farther back than should have been possible. The walls were lined with strange, twisting symbols carved into the wood, and the air hummed with a kind of electric energy that made my skin tingle. And there, in the flickering light of my headlamp, I saw them. Dozens of eyes, glowing green and gold in the shadows. They belonged to creatures like the one I'd encountered in the Smokies, tall and shaggy and unmistakably non-human. But they weren't threatening me. They were simply watching, their gazes filled with a kind of ancient wisdom and sorrow. One of the creatures stepped forward, and I realized with a shock that I recognized it. It was the same being I'd spoken with that terrifying night, all those years ago. It regarded me silently for a long moment, then spoke in that grinding, stone-on-stone voice I remembered so well. "We knew you would come, human. You have proven yourself persistent." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I got an email. Coordinates. It said I wasn't the only one who knew the truth. Was that you? The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh or a growl. "Not us. There are others of your kind, seekers like yourself, who have brushed against the edges of our world. Some of them wish to protect our secrets. Others would use them for their own ends." A chill ran down my spine at the implications. "So why call me here? Why reveal yourselves again after warning me away?" The creature sighed, a sound like wind through ancient branches. "Because the time of our hiding grows short. Your kind pushes ever further into our domains, driven by your insatiable hunger to uncover and possess. Soon there will be no shadows deep enough to conceal us." It fixed me with a piercing stare, its eyes boring into mine. "A change is coming, human. A reckoning between your world and ours, and you, in your relentless quest for knowledge, have made yourself a part of it, whether you wish it or not." My mind reeled, trying to process the enormity of what I was hearing. What does that mean? What am I supposed to do?" The creature shook its shaggy head. "That is for you to discover. But know this, the fate of both our kinds may rest on the choices you make in the days to come. Tread carefully, human, and remember, not all secrets are meant to be brought into the light." With that cryptic warning, the creatures began to melt back into the shadows, their forms becoming indistinct and fading into the darkness of the hollow. I called out, pleading for more answers, but my words fell on empty air. I stumbled out of the oak's embrace and back into the valley, my head spinning with revelations and new questions. The creature's words echoed in my mind. A reckoning was coming, and somehow, I was to play a part in it. But what part? And how could I possibly navigate the tangled web of secrets and agendas I'd found myself caught in? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that my time chasing myths and shadows in the wilderness had brought me to a precipice, the tipping point between the world I knew and realms beyond my understanding. As I hiked out of the valley and back toward civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into an uncertain future. one where the lines between legend and reality had blurred beyond recognition. The creature's warning rang in my ears, tread carefully. But I knew, deep in my bones, that, careful or not, my path was now irrevocably intertwined with the ancient mysteries of the forest. What that path would lead to, I could only guess. But one thing was certain. My days as a simple park ranger, patrolling the trails and maintaining the illusion of a tame, orderly wilderness, were over. I had seen beyond the veil, and there could be no going back. The only way was forward, into the heart of the unknown. And so, with equal parts fear and determination, I walked on, ready to face whatever secrets and challenges the forest had in store. The reckoning the creature spoke of was coming, and one way or another, I would be ready to meet it. I've always considered the Belgian forests my second home. Growing up in a small village near Liège, I spent countless weekends exploring the dense woodlands of the Ardennes with my father. He was a forester by profession, and his deep respect for these ancient woods was passed down to me through our many expeditions. He would point out native flora, identify bird calls, and share tales of the region's rich history, how these same trees had witnessed the march of Roman legions, medieval knights, and modern armies. The forest remembers everything, he'd tell me. It absorbs our stories into its bark and soil. As a child, I accepted these woods as a place of wonder and adventure. As an adult, I came to appreciate them as a sanctuary, a respite from my structured life as a civil engineer in Brussels. At 32 years old, I maintained my connection to these forests through regular hiking trips, sometimes alone, sometimes with my partner Amelia, a biochemist whose scientific mind complemented my more intuitive approach to nature. What I'm about to share occurred over 3 consecutive years. Experiences that defied rational explanation and challenged everything I understood about these familiar landscapes. I document them not to sensationalize or to convince anyone of supernatural phenomena, but simply to record what happened as faithfully as my memory allows. I've never considered myself superstitious. My profession demands precision and evidence-based thinking. Amelia is even more skeptical, approaching the world through the lens of empirical science. That we both experienced 2 of these events makes them harder to dismiss as mere hallucinations or misperceptions. Before I begin, I should clarify that I've altered some geographical details, not to obscure the truth, but out of respect for these places. The forests of Belgium have enough visitors without adding curious thrill-seekers to their paths. These woods deserve our respect, not our intrusion. The first incident occurred in May 2018, near a small village called Bremont, close to the French border. I was hiking alone that day. Amelia was attending a conference in Amsterdam, on a well-established trail I had traversed at least a dozen times before. The 18-kilometer loop typically took me 6 hours to complete, including breaks, and I had started early to ensure I'd finish well before sunset. The morning unfolded perfectly. Spring had fully arrived, and the forest floor was carpeted with wood anemones and wild garlic. The beech trees had just unfurled their fresh leaves, creating a luminous green canopy overhead. By midday, I had made excellent progress and stopped in a small clearing to eat my lunch, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and an apple. As I finished eating, I noticed a sudden change in the forest's atmosphere. The birdsong, which had been a constant backdrop all morning, abruptly ceased. In the woods, such silence often indicates the presence of a predator, a fox perhaps, or a wildcat. I stood up, scanning the surrounding trees, but saw nothing unusual. Still, the unnatural quiet disturbed me. Forests are never truly silent. There's always the rustle of leaves, the buzzing of insects, the distant calls of birds. This silence felt absolute, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. I packed my belongings and continued along the trail, hoping to shake the growing unease that had settled over me. 10 minutes later, I reached a familiar stream crossing, a narrow brook with several flat stones serving as a natural bridge. I had crossed it many times before without incident. Today was different. As I approached, I felt a peculiar pressure in the air, like the heaviness that precedes a thunderstorm. But the sky remained clear, a peaceful blue visible through gaps in the canopy. Standing on the opposite bank was a figure. At first glance, it appeared to be a hiker in a long, dark coat, unusual attire for the warm spring day. But as I focused on this individual, I realized they were unnaturally still. Not the stillness of someone pausing to admire the view, but an absolute immobility that seemed impossible for a living being. They didn't sway slightly as humans naturally do when standing. They didn't appear to breathe. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, dressed in what looked like antiquated clothing, something from another century. I couldn't make out a face beneath what seemed to be a wide-brimmed hat, despite the bright sunlight overhead. Thinking it might be another hiker in distress, I raised my hand in greeting and called out, "Bonjour, tout va bien?" No response. No movement. A profound sense of wrongness washed over me. The figure seemed too tall, too thin, too still to be human. Yet there it stood, undeniably present. I hesitated, but decided to proceed. The alternative was backtracking several kilometers. I stepped onto the first stone, then the second, keeping my eyes fixed on the strange figure. When I looked up again after navigating a wobbly stone, the figure had vanished. There had been no sound of retreating footsteps, no rustle of undergrowth. The bank where they had stood was empty, as though they had never been there at all. I scanned the surrounding forest, but saw no sign of movement. What happened next is difficult to articulate. As I completed the crossing, the world around me subtly shifted. The quality of light changed, taking on a bluish tinge that made the familiar forest appear alien. The temperature dropped noticeably, despite the spring sunshine. The very air felt thicker, more resistant as I moved through it. I continued hiking, deeply unsettled but determined to complete the trail. Nothing else unusual occurred for about a kilometer. Then, as suddenly as it had disappeared, the birdsong returned, erupting all at once in a discordant chorus that made me physically startle. Simultaneously, the temperature rose, and the light returned to its normal golden-green hue. It was as though I had crossed an invisible boundary, exiting whatever strange pocket of reality I had entered. When I checked my phone that evening, I discovered something impossible. Despite maintaining my usual pace, I was 2 hours behind schedule. 2 hours I cannot account for. 2 hours lost in a section of trail that should have taken 20 minutes to traverse. I told no one about this experience for months. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? I considered medical explanations, a minor stroke perhaps, or a complex migraine affecting my perception of time and reality. But I felt healthy, and no symptoms recurred in the days and weeks that followed. Eventually, I shared the experience with Amelia, who suggested it might have been a rare atmospheric phenomenon affecting light and sound, combined with an encounter with a peculiarly dressed hiker who had moved away while my attention was elsewhere. Her explanation was comforting, if not entirely convincing. I might have accepted this rational interpretation had it not been for what happened the following year. The weeks following my experience at Bremen were marked by a persistent unease that I couldn't shake. I found myself questioning my perception of reality and wondering if I had experienced some kind of psychological episode. I researched temporal lobe seizures, which can cause distortions in time perception and hallucinations, but found no other symptoms that matched my experience. Sleep became difficult. When I did manage to rest, my dreams were filled with endless forests and pathways that shifted and changed as I walked them. I would wake disoriented, uncertain for a moment whether I was in my apartment in Brussels or lost in some liminal woodland space. My work suffered. As an engineer, precision is essential, but I found myself making small errors, my concentration fracturing at crucial moments. Colleagues noticed my distraction, and my supervisor gently suggested I take some vacation time. "You look exhausted, Julian," he said. "When was your last proper break?" I took his advice and spent a week visiting my parents in Liège, deliberately avoiding the forests that had been my sanctuary. Instead, I helped my father in his vegetable garden and accompanied my mother on her errands around town. The mundane routines grounded me, and gradually, the experience at Bremont receded in my mind, becoming less immediate, less threatening. By autumn, I had rationalized the incident, as Amelia suggested. An unusual atmospheric condition, a strange hiker, and my own exhaustion combining to create an experience that seemed supernatural but had perfectly natural explanations. I began hiking again, though I avoided solitary expeditions and stuck to popular trails with frequent fellow hikers. Amelia often accompanied me, her practical nature a bulwark against lingering fears. "The forest is just a forest," she would say when I grew quiet, lost in memory. "Trees and dirt and animals, nothing more, nothing less." I wanted desperately to believe her. October 2019 brought the second incident, more disturbing than the first because Amelia witnessed it too, eliminating the possibility of individual hallucination. We had planned a weekend away in the Walloon region, staying at a rustic bed and breakfast in a village near the forests of La Houppe. These woods are associated with one of Belgium's most enduring folk legends, that of Ginty, a malevolent spirit said to haunt lonely trails, especially near bodies of water. According to local tales, Ginty appears in various guises: a shadow with glowing eyes, a black dog, sometimes even as a human figure that vanishes when approached. The stories claim he lures travelers from their paths, leading them into bogs or dangerous terrain. Amelia and I had laughed about these stories over dinner the night before our hike. She dismissed them as typical rural superstitions, born from misinterpreted natural phenomena and perpetuated to explain disappearances that likely had more mundane causes. "People get lost in forests because they're bad at navigation," she said. not because supernatural entities lead them astray. Our planned route would take us through dense woodland and past several small ponds. We set out early, equipped with topographical maps, compass, ample water, and energy bars. The autumn colors were spectacular. Maples blazing scarlet, oaks in russet and gold, the forest floor a tapestry of fallen leaves. We hiked for about 4 hours, stopping occasionally to photograph particularly striking vistas or examine interesting fungi. As dusk approached, we decided to head back to avoid navigating the more challenging sections of trail in darkness. Though we carried headlamps, neither of us relished the idea of a night hike through unfamiliar terrain. As the light faded, a mist began to rise from the forest floor. This wasn't unusual for autumn evenings in Belgium, but it thickened with unusual rapidity, reducing visibility to approximately 10 meters in any direction. We stayed close to the marked path, moving more cautiously now, maintaining a conversation to reassure ourselves. That's when we saw the first light. It appeared to our right, perhaps 30 meters into the forest, a pale blue-green glow hovering about a meter above the ground. My initial thought was bioluminescent fungi, though I'd never encountered any so bright in Belgian forests. "What is that?" Amelia whispered, gripping my arm. Before I could respond, another identical light appeared to our left, and then another ahead of us. Within moments, we found ourselves encircled by perhaps a dozen of these glowing orbs, all the same size and color, all hovering at the same height. "They look like lanterns," Amelia said, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what we were seeing. But they weren't lanterns. These lights moved independently with a fluid, almost organic motion, occasionally pulsing brighter before dimming again. They formed a perfect circle around us, gradually closing in. We stood back to back, watching these entities approach. Neither of us suggested running. The path was now obscured by mist, and the forest floor was treacherous with hidden roots and sudden drops. Then, from somewhere beyond the lights came a sound I'll never forget, a dry, rattling hiss, like chains being dragged across dead leaves, followed by the distinct splashing of something heavy moving through water. The nearest pond was at least 100 meters away. One of the lights darted forward, stopping about 5 meters from us. In its glow, I could now discern that the mist around it seemed to coalesce into a vague humanoid shape, a suggestion of a torso, a head, limbs that were too long and moved in ways that human limbs should not. "We need to go," I told Amelia, my voice barely audible. We began retreating, still facing the lights. They followed but maintained their distance, never breaking their circle. The rattling sound grew closer, and with it came a smell of stagnant water and decay. Amelia, ever practical, remembered her phone. She activated its flashlight and directed the beam toward the nearest light. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The bright white beam seemed to physically repel the ghostly glow, which recoiled as if in pain. The misty shape surrounding it contorted, and the hissing rose to an almost unbearable pitch. We seized the opportunity to run in the direction we'd been heading, Amelia's phone light carving a path through the now retreating lights. Behind us, the hissing and splashing continued, gradually fading as we fled. After several minutes of desperate running, we burst from the mist onto a clear section of path. The forest around us appeared normal again. No lights, no strange sounds, just the peaceful evening woods. We continued running until we reached our car, neither of us willing to slow down despite burning lungs and aching muscles. Later, researching what we might have seen, we found references to fufalas in local folklore, marsh lights said to be the souls of the unrestful dead, or sometimes manifestations of Jinti himself. The scientific explanation would be ignited methane from decomposing organic matter, will-o'-the-wisps, a documented natural phenomenon. But that wouldn't account for their coordinated movement, the shapes in the mist, or that terrible rattling hiss. Whatever we encountered that night, it wasn't described in any scientific journal Amelia could find. The experience at La Houppe fundamentally changed our relationship. Shared trauma creates a unique bond, and surviving something inexplicable together forged a connection between us that transcended our previous partnership. Amelia, despite her scientific background, or perhaps because of it, became obsessed with understanding what had happened. She approached the mystery with methodical determination, creating a database of similar reported phenomena and analyzing patterns. There must be a rational explanation, she insisted, surrounded by research papers and local historical records. Even if it's something science hasn't fully documented yet. She contacted geologists about unusual mineral deposits that might affect electromagnetic fields, meteorologists about rare atmospheric conditions, and biologists about bioluminescent organisms native to Belgian forests. She even reached out to local historians to learn more about the folklore surrounding La Houppe and similar locations. Her research yielded interesting but inconclusive results. The region did have unusual geological features, a high concentration of iron and quartz that could theoretically influence electromagnetic phenomena. There were also historical accounts dating back centuries of similar experiences in the same forest, though details varied across time periods. Folk memory contains kernels of truth, Amelia conceded one evening, after weeks of investigation. People experience something real but explain it through the cultural framework available to them. Medieval peasants saw forest spirits, Victorian travelers saw ghosts. We try to see natural phenomena. But what if what's happening doesn't fit neatly into our current scientific understanding? This was a significant concession from someone who had built her career on empirical evidence and reproducible results. For my part, I approached our experience differently. I spoke with local residents, particularly older people who had lived near La Houppe all their lives. Their attitude surprised me, not fear or superstition, but a matter-of-fact acceptance. The forest has its own rules, an elderly farmer told me. Places where the normal world thins out. You were lucky to find your way back. When I pressed for details about what exactly he believed was happening in these woods, he shrugged. Does it matter what we call it? The forest keeps its secrets. Better that way. Despite our different approaches, neither Amelia nor I found satisfactory explanations for what we had witnessed. The lights, the misty figures, the hissing sound, none could be fully explained by known natural phenomena. We might have eventually filed the experience away as an unsolvable mystery had it not been for what happened the following summer. The summer of 2020 found Belgium, like much of the world, under the shadow of a global pandemic. After months of lockdown in our Brussels apartment, Amelia and I were desperate for open spaces and fresh air. When restrictions eased, we immediately planned a day hike in the Sonian forest, just outside the city. Unlike our previous experiences, this location seemed safe, a popular recreational area frequented by families, cyclists, and joggers. On weekends, you could hardly walk 5 minutes without encountering other people. We chose a Sunday in July, and as expected, the main paths were busy with people enjoying their newly regained freedom. Seeking a bit more solitude, we took a less traveled side trail that I knew eventually reconnected with the main loop. This smaller path was still marked and maintained, just less popular due to its steeper sections. The day was warm and pleasant. Sunlight filtered through the ancient beech trees, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. We had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I realized I could no longer hear the distant voices of other hikers or the occasional bicycle bell. Not unusual for this side path, but there was something else missing too. The distant hum of the city that normally formed a faint background soundtrack in the Sonian forest. Is it just me, or is it too quiet? Amelia asked, pausing to look around. As we continued walking, I noticed something strange about the path ahead. Though it was a clear day, the trail seemed to fade into a hazy distance that shouldn't have been possible in the forest. Sections of the path that should have been visible were obscured, as though the trail itself was materializing just a few meters ahead of us at a time. Then we noticed the trees. The Sonian forest is famous for its cathedral-like beech trees, tall, straight trunks creating a high open canopy. But the trees around us now looked different, older, more gnarled, with lower branches creating a tunnel-like effect over the path. I didn't recognize the species, which was impossible. I knew every native tree in Belgium. We should go back, Amelia said quietly, and I nodded in agreement. We turned around, only to find that the path behind us looked just as unfamiliar as the one ahead. The trees were wrong, the quality of light was wrong, and the path itself seemed narrower than it had been moments before. We chose to continue in our original direction, reasoning that we would eventually hit the main trail again. We walked for 40 minutes, the longest 40 minutes of my life, but the forest around us became increasingly unfamiliar, like we had somehow stepped into ancient woodland untouched by modern forestry management. Neither of us said it aloud, but we both knew this wasn't the Sonian forest anymore. This wasn't anywhere in Belgium that I recognized. We soon came to a clearing that was perfectly circular, as if deliberately formed. As we stepped into this space, a vibration ran through the ground beneath our feet. For an instant, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a tall, thin shape, similar to the figure I had encountered at Brabant 2 years earlier. A wave of primal fear washed over me, and Amelia must have felt it too. Without a word, we both turned and ran, no longer caring which direction we took, desperate only to escape this wrong version of a familiar forest. We ran until our lungs burned, following whatever path we could find. Then, between one step and the next, everything changed. We stumbled onto a wide, gravel-covered main trail, nearly colliding with a group of cyclists. We were back in the normal, familiar Sonian forest, surrounded by weekend visitors and normal beech trees. The cyclists swerved to avoid us, shouting irritated warnings as they passed. Amelia and I stood there, gasping for breath, looking back at the narrow trail we had emerged from, a trail that now looked perfectly ordinary, leading into perfectly ordinary woods. "What just happened?" Amelia whispered, her scientific certainty shattered for the second time in a year. I had no answer for her. In the months that followed our experience in the Sonian forest, Amelia and I began to notice connections between our three encounters. What initially seemed like isolated incidents revealed patterns when examined collectively. All three events had occurred near water, a stream crossing, ponds, and, as we later discovered, an underground spring beneath that circular clearing in the Sonian forest. All had involved a strange quality of light and an unnatural silence preceding the phenomena. And all had featured a threshold of sorts, a point where the normal world seemed to give way to something else. "It's like temporary thin spots between realities," Amelia suggested one evening as we reviewed our notes. "Places where the boundaries between worlds become permeable, under specific conditions." This was a startling theory from someone who had once dismissed forest legends as mere superstition. But our experiences had changed her, just as they had changed me. We began researching similar accounts throughout Belgian history. The archives yielded numerous reports of strange encounters in forests, travelers finding themselves in unfamiliar terrain despite following known paths, mysterious figures observed at crossroads or near bodies of water, lights and sounds that defied explanation. Many of these accounts came from credible sources: military officers, government officials, clergy, and physicians, people whose observations would typically be trusted. These weren't just peasant superstitions or folk tales, they were documented experiences similar to our own. One report from 1887 particularly resonated with us. A Belgian botanist named Guillaume Leroy had been collecting specimens in the Ardennes when he found himself in what he described as a forest of ancient aspect, containing species unknown to modern science. He wandered for hours before suddenly finding himself back on a familiar path, with samples of plants he couldn't identify, which later dissolved into common forest detritus in his collection box. Amelia's scientific mind couldn't accept the supernatural explanations that local folklore offered, forest spirits, nature deities, or the unquiet dead. But neither could she ignore the evidence of her own experiences. "What if these are natural phenomena that science hasn't classified yet?" she proposed. "Quantum physics already suggests multiple realities existing simultaneously. What if these forest experiences are moments when those realities overlap?" It was as good an explanation as any, better than most, as it didn't require belief in the supernatural, merely an expansion of what we consider natural. For my part, I had begun to wonder if these experiences were less about physics and more about perception. If certain places in these ancient forests somehow altered human consciousness, allowing us to perceive aspects of reality normally filtered out by our brains. The Belgian Ardennes are among the oldest forests in Europe, with human presence dating back thousands of years. Perhaps, I thought, these woods had absorbed something of human consciousness over millennia, creating zones where the boundary between objective reality and subjective perception became blurred. Whatever the explanation, one thing was certain: neither Amelia nor I would ever view the forests of our homeland the same way again. 3 years have passed since our encounter in the Sonian forest. In that time, Amelia and I have married and moved from Brussels to a small town near Namur, where we both now work remotely. She as a research consultant, I as an engineering project manager. Our home sits at the edge of woodland, not deep forest, but a pleasant stretch of mixed trees that offers privacy and connection to nature. We still hike regularly, though we've developed what might seem like superstitious practices to others, avoiding forest paths at dusk or dawn, steering clear of unusual silence, and always carrying powerful flashlights. We haven't experienced anything as dramatic as our 3 encounters, though there have been moments of strangeness. Paths that seem longer returning than they were going out, sudden temperature drops with no meteorological explanation, the occasional glimpse of movement just at the periphery of vision. We've learned to live with these minor occurrences, to accept them as part of our relationship with these ancient woods. Fear has given way to respect, a profound awareness that the natural world contains mysteries beyond our current understanding. Recently, I visited my father, now retired but still living near the forests where he once worked. I finally shared our experiences with him, expecting skepticism or concern. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. The old foresters had a saying, he told me: "The forest has many doors, but not all lead to the same place." I've had my own strange moments in these woods over the years, nothing as dramatic as yours, but enough to make me wonder. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked. He smiled. "Would you have believed me? Some things need to be experienced firsthand." He was right, of course. Before my encounter at Bremont, I would have dismissed such stories as imagination or exaggeration. Experience is a more effective teacher than warning. Amelia continues her research, now focusing on environmental factors that might trigger altered states of consciousness, specific combinations of barometric pressure, electromagnetic fields, and atmospheric conditions. She's published several papers on environmental triggers for temporal spatial disorientation in forest settings, carefully framed within acceptable scientific parameters while still exploring our experiences. As for me, I've made peace with not knowing. Some mysteries resist classification, existing in the spaces between established categories of knowledge. The forests of Belgium have been part of human history for thousands of years, accumulating stories, beliefs, and experiences. Perhaps what we encountered were echoes of that collective history, moments when the veil between past and present, between different ways of perceiving reality, temporarily thinned. I still love these woods and find solace in their ancient presence, but I walk them differently now, with greater awareness and respect for their complexities. I understand that they operate according to rhythms and patterns beyond human comprehension, occasionally revealing glimpses of something larger and stranger than our everyday reality. The forests of Belgium have been my companions since childhood. They've taught me wonder, respect, and now, humility in the face of mystery. I continue to explore their paths, knowing that some questions may never be answered, and finding, somewhat to my surprise, that I can live contentedly with this uncertainty. Some doors in the forest will always remain closed, and perhaps it's better that way. But I remain alert for those that might briefly open, offering glimpses of what lies beyond our ordinary understanding of the world. After all, as my father always said, the forest remembers everything. And sometimes, if we're paying attention, it shares those memories with us.